2000s, Suzanne Collins wrote one of the greatest young adult novel series of all time. This series had an amazing main character who was dropped into something much bigger than them, who was tough and courageous, a bit stoic and maybe seemingly cold at times, but still super relatable to the reader. The book touched on fairly deep and scary themes like politics, the horrors of war, and how difficult it can be to make peace with your destiny and to do the right thing for the masses, even when it comes at a cost to yourself. Of course, I'm talking about Gregor the Overlander. Okay, jokes aside, Suzanne Collins is obviously way more well known for the Hunger Games series, which was her second series, and it's super awesome, very tight and concise and coherent in its themes, and it obviously was later on developed into one of the most successful dystopian film franchises really of all time. There are tons of videos about the Hunger Games, and it's really great, but a lot of people care about that series, and this is things no one cares about. So obviously we're going to be talking about the Hunger Games criminally underrated and underread younger brother, Gregor the Overlander. So the Underland Chronicles, which is the official name for the series, although I kind of just call it like Gregor the Overlander series, so sorry about that. They were decently reviewed when they came out back in the early 2000s. They didn't make quite a splash like the Hunger Games, but according to Suzanne Collins' website, the first book was on the New York Times bestsellers list, along with some other bestsellers lists and recommended reading lists like the New York Public Library's 100 Titles for Reading and Sharing, and the book also won some minor awards like the Pennsylvania Young Reader's Choice Award for 2005-2006. So when I first read these books, they fascinated me for a lot of reasons. There's a romance element, which is kind of always really great for young people. There's also like a human-animal bond, which like I loved as a kid. That's also why I loved The Golden Compass as a kid. One of the most gripping aspects of the story, and pretty much like the main theme of the story, the main tension, is the political scene in the underworld that Gregor kind of stumbles upon. So if you have read The Hunger Games, then you know that Suzanne Collins is really incredibly skilled at creating very realistic and complex political backgrounds that are also digestible for teens and young adults. And she was largely inspired by her family background with war and the devastation it brings. So in a New York Times article written around the Hunger Games series, a journalist interviewed Suzanne Collins and goes through a bit of this background. So her grandfather was gassed in World War I, her uncle was injured in World War II, and her father served in the Vietnam War, giving him lifelong trauma. And Collins explains to the interviewer that her father thought it was incredibly important to educate his children and children in general on the horrors of war. And in relation to the Hunger Games series and its themes, Suzanne Collins told the interviewer, "I don't write about adolescence, I write about war for adolescents." And even though she's talking about the Hunger Games in that article, I think that it is incredibly applicable to Gregor the Overlander. And I think in a lot of ways, Gregor the Overlander kind of served as like a primer for her to then write the Hunger Games. So the realism of the war in Gregor was so important to her that while writing the first book, she often spoke to her father about allyships and enemies and political dynamics that would make sense from a military perspective. He unfortunately passed before this book was published. As you may know about me, I really love to reread books from my childhood, so today I'd like to take you with me on my rereading of the Underland Chronicles. And throughout this recap, I'd like to pay special attention to kind of like the alliance, the enemies, the political, and the war aspect of this series. So if you haven't read this book or these books, and if you love the Hunger Games, read these please before spoiling them for yourselves. And if you were a young boy when Hunger Games came out and you didn't read them because they were marketed more towards a girl audience, read these and then read the Hunger Games series. Like, come on now, what are you doing? But seriously, if you've ever thought about reading these, stop this video and go get them from your library, or watch this anyways and then read them after the fact, because I really cannot do them justice in the recap. I do want to note though that there will be discussion of fictional genocide and violence and wars that have parallels to real world events, some of which are currently ongoing, and these discussions won't come until the last two books. I'll give a reminder then, and I'm also going to stay away from more graphic descriptions or really directly tying them to real world events, so I'll kind of leave that to you to tie them to any real world events, historical or current. This series is for young adults and teens, so the description of them is very much in that age range, but it is a very key part of the series, so I can't really, I can't shy away from it too much, so use your judgment on if this video is for you. So with that, let's get into the first book, Gregor the Overlander. So let's meet our titular protagonist, Gregor. So Gregor is an 11-year-old not white boy living in New York City. He has two younger sisters, Lizzie and Margaret. Margaret is better known as Boots in the series, and Gregor has been raised by his mother and his increasingly senile grandmother ever since his father went missing 2 years ago. And you may have noticed I said Gregor is not white. Suzanne Collins doesn't totally specify his race, but he's almost certainly not white. Here are just a couple of lines that point out that he is a person of color. So when he first meets a girl named Luxa, I'll talk about her later, she refers to Boots saying, "I've never seen brown before, not on a human," or this, "She caught Boots's wrist and ran her fingers over the silky light brown skin. It must need much light." And it's not a tan because this is a 2-year-old, so I don't think she's like just a white person who's tanned. And then Gregor's skin color is also of particular note because he resembles his father, and this is really interesting and noteworthy because a couple of characters mark his shade, and it's not just related to him being an overlander. So I didn't really explain this very well, but basically I just wanted to point out why I think that Gregor is not white and why I feel like the book kind of supports that, because I do feel like that was pretty noteworty at the time, especially given that Suzanne Collins is a white author, and that kind of thing just did not really happen that much in the 2000s where, you know, white authors wrote about non-white protagonists, and unfortunately it doesn't really happen that much still now to this day. So that's why I just kind of wanted to point it out. I know that there is some disagreement about this online, but I do personally think that it's pretty evident that they're not white. So take that as you will, but I personally wanted to mention it because I think that it's important, and especially as the book gets into some more political kind of themes, I just think that it kind of adds to it, and I think that it was a purposeful choice on Suzanne Collins' part. So that's why I just wanted to mention it. But anyways, one day while Gregor's mom is at work and Lizzie is at summer camp, Gregor takes Boots to go do some laundry in the laundry room of their building in New York City, and they fall through a grate in the laundry room into the underworld. And the underworld in this series isn't like hell or anything like that. It's basically just like caves and tunnels and such that are deep, deep below New York City, and probably under like a large area outside of New York City too as well. It's kind of like a big world, the underworld. And it doesn't take long for Gregor to stumble into the tense politics of the underworld, as him and his sister are found by the crawlers, who are massive roaches. So every creature in the underworld has 2 names, so you'll hear me use both names. But they think that Boots is a princess, and Gregor laughs at this because it is funny, but he offends the roaches, and like one thing you gotta know about Gregor is he's gonna offend people, okay? Because number 1, he is 11 in a strange and foreign world, and 2, he has no filter, also probably related to the fact that he's 11, and 3, most important for this video topic, is that it's pretty easy to offend the Underlanders and to kind of put them on guard because they're so on guard from this kind of like already tense political landscape. So because they like Boots and they think that she is a princess, the crawlers take the 2 of them to the kingdom of Regalia, which is the kingdom of human underlanders. And when they get there, they enter this massive stadium where there are a lot of humans riding giant bats or flyers. The humans are extremely pale and basically translucent, and they have purple eyes. I have a really stupid tangent about this bit that I'll come back to in a bit. Basically, they have like no melanin at all. So now let's meet that girl Luxa, or Queen Luxa. I always thought that her name was Luxa, but they like literally spell it out. When I was rereading, I was like, damn, I like never read that the last like 5 times we reread that. But anyways, her name is Luxa. The first conversation with Luxa and her grandparents, who are named Vicus and Solivet, is really where we start to see some of this evidence of how delicate the peace is in the Underland and how tense everything is. So Luxa and the roaches, they start haggling over what the price is for Gregor and Boots. And it becomes evident that the crawlers don't really have a strong allegiance with any species. They basically just take like any rare overlanders to whoever would like trade them more, or like they basically like trade only on like a financial basis. And they probably would have taken Gregor and Boots to the rats if it weren't for them liking Boots so much. So Luxa tries to lowball them. This insults them. They refuse, and Luxa's like, okay, well then take them to the rats if they'll pay you more. And then Vicus is like, everybody, let's calm down. So he makes a deal with them, trades with them, and Luxa makes like a snarky comment basically saying like, if Vicus always had his way, then there wouldn't be any grain or any food left for the humans. So we're getting some hints of food scarcity, and also we kind of start to see that Vicus is the nice and diplomatic character, and that will continue on through the series. After this, Gregor insults Vicus by implying that the humans killed any other overlanders that fell down here. And Vicus is like, okay, rude. But then Gregor asks Vicus if the crawlers would kill the overlanders, and Vicus is like, no, that wouldn't give them any time. And so time in the underland is like basically a metaphor for life, as is light. So light and time symbolize life. This will become evident later and relevant when we start going through some of the prophecies in this book series. But Vicus is basically just saying that the crawlers trade the overlanders and like other stuff just for political gains. Roaches don't really need anything from other species. The main thing that they need is to like not be targeted and killed, because they're not great fighters. They do kind of always like retreat. They're like roaches in the real world. They're just giant. So the last really noteworthy political aspect we learn in this beginning part is that the humans are always on guard. So the roaches always approach with lights. Even though they don't need torches, they approach with torches so that the humans know they're not trying to ambush them, and it's like a sign of peace. And this lack of trust is kind of built into the foundation of Regalia. So as they approach the palace, Gregor is like, there is no door here, and Vicus is like, well, doors are for people who don't have enemies. Well, then how do they get in? Well, they get in because they fly on those giant bats and they kind of fly in. So those bats, or the flyers, are really the only like true allies that the humans have. Vicus's wife and girl boss military strategist, Solivet, who we'll talk a lot about in this video, explains that soon after arriving in the Underland, the humans formed an alliance with the bats because the two species were like mutually beneficial to each other. So beyond this species-wide alliance, individual humans and individual bats also bond, and bonding is a super important thing in the underworld. Basically, you're responsible for the lives of one another, and you kind of trust each other implicitly. And there are big consequences if you abandon your bond, or let them die, or betray them, things like that. We met Luxa. We also meet her cousin, Henry, and he reminds me of this guy from Saltburn. And honestly, Luxa's kind of on this vibe as well, like, at least when we first meet her. They're both really rude and stuck up, and they do have like valid chips on their shoulders, but this is not excused by that. They're just really rude. Nerissa, Henry's sister, is not rude, but she is really fragile and also seen as a little like crazy because she supposedly has these visions. Then they have dinner, and while at dinner, Vicus explains how the humans came to live in the underworld. Not all of it was clear, but it seemed the people had come here from England in the 1600s. Yes, they were led here by a stonemason, one Bartholomew of Sandwich, said Vicus, and Gregor had to work to keep a straight face. He had visions of the future, he saw the Underland in a dream, and he set out to find it. Sandwich and a group of followers had sailed to New York, where he got on famously with the local tribe. The Underland was no secret to the Native Americans, who had made periodic trips below the earth for ritual purposes for hundreds of years. They had little interest in living there and didn't care if Sandwich was mad enough to want to. Of course, he was quite sane, said Vicus. He knew that one day the earth would be empty of life, except what was sustained beneath the ground. Gregor thought it might be rude to tell Vicus that billions of people lived up there now. Instead, he asked, so everybody just packed up and moved down here? Heavens no. It was 50 years before the 800 were down and the gates to the overland sealed. We had to know we could feed ourselves and have walls to keep us safe. Rome was not built in a day, Vicus laughed. So this is where I'm pulling in my stupid tangent. I read that and I was like, I wonder if the 400 years like between when they moved down here and present time, if 400 years is enough time for them to actually lose all their melanin and become like totally pale, because that's only like 15 generations, which is not that much time evolutionarily. And then I kept reading, and there's this little anecdote on like a page or so after this where Gregor reminisces on a time when him and his father watched a show about cavefish that didn't have eyes, and then scientists brought the cavefish up to like out of the cave, and then they sensed light and they grew eyes. And then Gregor and his dad went to the American Museum of Natural History to like learn about cave animals. And I was like, this seems like purposely put next to this, almost to like give it veracity that like it could happen. So I was like, I wonder if this experiment is real. And I found out that it's like kind of real. And I found this resource from the actual like American Museum of Natural History, which I think is a fair bet as to where like Suzanne Collins got this experiment, since she lived in New York City at the time, and she mentions like this, like she mentions it in relation to the museum. Granted, this resource is a 6th to 8th grade field trip assignment, but honestly I think that that's fine for my purposes. And so it doesn't go into like much detail, but like it's fine. But in the experiment mentioned, the cavefish that they brought up, they did develop eyes, but they only developed eyes after the eye lens from a like normal fish, like a land fish, was like introduced. And this was noteworthy because it meant that the fish still had the genes to create a functioning eye, but they just had a mutation in their genes that kind of told them to not create eyes. So then when they introduced the eye lens into the cavefish, that gene got turned on and they were able to create functioning eyes. In the book experiment, though, Gregor just says that the fish sensed light and then the eyes grew. And I think this is really interesting because like, people kind of think that evolution like works with a motive or like almost has a mind of its own, but evolution really only happens like when a trait is favorable or not favorable towards breeding and passing on the genes. So the logic of the fish lost their eyes because they didn't need them anymore doesn't make sense evolutionarily. So in the fish example, this was kind of a mystery because they didn't really know what the benefit was to not having eyes. They theorized that it was because this gene that tells them to make eyes is linked to another gene that is favorable or not favorable to breeding and living. So in the fish example, they discovered that not having eyes helped them to have more space on their face and stuff for better noses, which does help them to survive. So I swear. So how this is related is, for the underlanders, we're looking at melanin. And again, like eyes, there's no real benefit to not having melanin underground. Melanin protects against UV rays and like also like some processes that like help protect against aging, and excess melanin does absorb the UV rays that you need to use the vitamin D. So this is why over time people in northern areas with less light eventually evolved to be paler so that they would be able to absorb vitamin D better. I think so I talked to my sister, who is a biologist and a bio teacher, and we decided that there would basically need to be an albino in the population with Bartholomew sandwich, and that person would have had to have a lot of kids in the population so that the zero melanin gene was already in the gene pool, or this would be, their like melanin genes would need to be tied to something like the nose for the fish, like having a better nose, so that it was like unfavorable for them to have melanin. So let's say that if like higher melanin was somehow linked to a gene that made you bad at riding the bats, then that would like wipe out a lot of people with higher melanin in the trait and like make it more possible to make it easier for a zero melanin trait to spread within the gene pool. And also this is taking into consideration the fact that she specifically mentions that Bartholomew sandwich was British, and British people are already kind of pale. So we decided that this was plausible, but not likely. And thank you for coming to my biology TED Talk. The other, just one more little evolutionary tangent, and this is related to linguistic anthropology because I have a background in linguistic anthropology and I have a master's degree in it. Thank you very much. But I think that the language aspect in this book series is really interesting, given that history. And so they like, the underlanders speak in this kind of like weird stilted language. It's kind of old school. I think that is very realistic. One thing that I don't think is realistic linguistically in this book is the names. So we know that there is like really tense politics, and that the humans like to keep themselves separated. They're very proud of like their human species, and there is very much like species on species like discrimination. And so because of that reason, and what typically happens in instances like that, is there are very strong policing of linguistic boundaries and linguistic markers such as the literal language you speak and the names. We'll talk more about the English language in this book, and how species communicate. We'll talk more about that later on in the series, but kind of like spoiler, we do know that all of them speak English and that this actually is a politicized thing, which makes sense. First thing that like fascist leaders do is try to like politicize their language and make sure that everybody in their country speaks one language that kind of marks that country. But I think that following that logic, the names should have remained more like stereotypical and historical like English names, because that would have been an aspect that they wanted to police as well. And Gregor even has a point where he kind of like makes fun of, I think, Henry's name. It's either Henry or a character later named Howard, but I think it's Henry, where he's kind of like, oh, Henry, this sounds like such a normal name when everybody else has names like Luxa, Vicus, Perdita, whatever. I actually think that all of them should have names like Henry. I think that they should all have old school English names. But anyways, that officially wraps my tangents, but it's my channel, I get to talk about what I want. But back to the plot. Gregor, after this dinner, he tries to escape, and he comes up against rats, and they are giant, and they are mean, and they attack after commenting on his skin tone. Those are the characters that mark his skin tone, specifically because they think he's like, they mark that he's that he looks like his dad. And thankfully though, Luxa, Henry, and 2 other humans named Meredith and Perdita, they arrive and they kill the rats. They dump them in the river and light this little like beach that they were on, they light it on fire. And then they head back to Regalia. So Gregor is like, okay, what the fuck? You guys could have told me that the rats were bad. Meredith and Luxa and basically everybody are mad at Gregor for trying to escape, which is fair because they really had not been mean to him at all yet, but they were extra pissed since people got injured on this rescue mission. And Vicus is mad at Luxa as well because as queen, even though she's only 11, as queen, she should not have been part of the rescue mission. So Vicus is very diplomatic though, and he has some important things to say to Gregor. Gregor the Overlander, there's much you do not understand. You do not speak, but your face speaks for you. You are worried, you are angered, you believe you are right to flee those who have kept you against your will. Okay, I guess I kind of did like trap him there, never mind. But you feel sorely that we have suffered in your saving. We told you not of the rats, yet Luxa blames you for our losses. We seem to be your enemy, and yet we gave you time. Gregor didn't answer. He thought that pretty much summed things up, except for the fact that Luxa had hit him. Vicus read his mind. Luxa should not have struck you, but your fight invited horrible death to those she loved. This is greatly felt by her, as both her parents were killed by rats. Luxa gasped. That is not his affair. She looked so distressed that Gregor almost objected as well. Whatever she'd done to him, this wasn't his business. But I make it so, Luxa, as I have cause to believe that Gregor himself may lack a father, continued Vicus. Now it was Gregor's turn to be shocked. How do you know that? I do not know for sure. I only guess. Tell me, Gregor the Overlander. Recognize you this? Vicus reached into his cloak and pulled something out. It was a metal ring. Several keys dangled from it, but it was the roughly braided loop of red, black, and blue leather that made Gregor's heart stop. He had woven it himself during crafts class at the very same summer camp that Lizzie was at now. You can make 3 things: a bracelet, a bookmark, a keychain. Gregor had picked the keychain, and his father never went anywhere without it. So, as you might have guessed, Gregor's dad did not just go missing, he fell through the same grate in the laundry room, only the rats unfortunately found him first. And for some reason, they are keeping him alive. Vicus thinks this is due to the rats thinking his dad can invent things, because his dad can invent things. I think he's a science teacher. And Vicus also explains that the rats are the humans' most bitter enemies. And I hate the way that the rats are portrayed in this series. It's a pretty common trope, though, for rats to kind of be symbols of, like, evil, conniving masterminds. In an interview that's in the back of my book, the interviewer asks Suzanne Collins if researching the creepy animals for the books kind of helped her to get over any fear for them. And she says that cockroaches are just germy, so she doesn't mind them, that she loves bats, and that she's still a bit afraid of spiders, although she finds them interesting and likes to watch them from a distance. But rats, she says, but rats, not pet rats, but the wild kind, I will always have what I consider to be a healthy fear of rats, and you should too. Wild rats are really only super dangerous when cornered, and that's mainly because of diseases. So if you like corner a wild rat and it feels like it has to bite you to get away, it could transmit diseases, but they don't really like seek out to bite you, you know? And I'm glad she does separate pet rats, because pet rats are the sweetest and most loving pets out there, and they get such a bad rap. And these are my babies that were my real babies that I had a couple years ago, and they are the sweetest thing ever, and they are always in my heart. So don't blame pet rats, because they're very cute and sweet. The other important piece of info that Vicus drops is that he believes Gregor to be the subject of the prophecy of Gray. And that is why the rats wanted him dead so bad. And this prophecy is the first of many in the series. There's basically one in every book, and they were all recorded by Bartholomew the Sandwich after he closed the gates to the overworld. So Gregor is super like blasé about the prophecies and understandably doesn't believe them at first, but then Luxa is like, well, one of them did correctly foretell the death of my parents, and Gregor is like, my bad. But let's go through the prophecy quickly. Beware underlanders, time hangs by a thread. The hunters are hunted, white water runs red. The gnars will strike to extinguish the rest. The hope of the hopeless resides in a quest. An overland warrior, a son of the sun, may bring us back light, he may bring us back none. But gather your neighbors and follow his call, or rats will most surely devour us all. Two over, two under, of royal descent, two flyers, two crawlers, two spinners ascent, one gnawer beside, and one lost up ahead, and 8 will be left when we count up the dead. The last who will die must decide where he stands. The fate of the 8 is contained in his hands. So bid him take care, bid him look where he leaps, as life may be death, and death life again reaps. So they work out that the prophecy is essentially saying that Gregor must gather 2 royal underlanders, 2 bats, 2 roaches, and 2 spiders to go and find his dad, and the fate of the human underlanders hinges on this mission. The end paragraph is the toughest to work out. We'll revisit that later though. And the events of this prophecy have already started. The hunters are hunted, white water runs red. That refers to the rats being killed and dumped in the river. And unfortunately for the underlanders, the Rat King, King Gorger, has found the 2 dead rats and has launched an assault on the humans, starting a war. Regalia launches into war mode, and Vicus is like, we have got to get you started on this quest, Gregor. So they set out to gather the other species mentioned in the prophecy so that they can start the quest. So, for this video, I'm going to be using some visual aids. One thing that I'm going to be using is I'm going to be using maps. So I wanted to like track each of their quests, because each book has a quest, so I'll be tracking that using this map. And this map is fan made. I'm going to be making like a couple changes to it in as I go through, but this is kind of the base map that I'm going to be using, and it was made by Catherine Sobol, who I will be talking a lot more about at the end of the series, and she is just a really like incredible and like prolific person in this fandom, and so again I'll be talking a bit more about some of her fan work at the end of this. But if you really like fan fiction, if you really like Gregor the Overlander, and you read them and always wanted more books or wanted like to spend more time in the Underland, definitely stick around for what I'll talk about after the first book in the series. But so I'll be using this map. I'll be making my own version of it for each of the books. But this is the base map. Really great map. One of my biggest complaints with this book series is I desperately wish they had an official map. It kind of makes sense why they don't, because it is from Gregor's perspective, and he doesn't see a map of the underworld until like book 3, I think. But they don't even bring it up there. They don't even show us a visual, which really bothers me. And I think it's obvious that Suzanne Collins has a map in her head, and maybe she even like made one, and I'm just like, please include it. I think it would have helped us visualize like these journeys a lot, although it does kind of add to the fact that like Gregor is very disoriented, especially at the beginning in the underworld, so it kind of makes sense. But this map helped loads, so yes, so stick around for the end to hear more about Catherine and some of her work. So naturally, they set out to kind of gather these other species, and naturally they start out with the bats, and I found this to be very interesting. So Gregor is like, well, we already have 2 bats, Aurora and Ares, who are Luxa and Henry's bonds, respectively. And Vicus is like, I mean, we kind of have them, but we have to get the official permission of the Bat King, or the Bat Queen, before we can kind of head off on this quest. Because we have to discuss like war, like now that we're in war, this changes things, and a quest is like a big political deal, so we can't just like take the bats with us. And this really helps to kind of illustrate the fact that like the Bat Kingdom and Regalia are different to Gregor, and probably to the reader when you first read the series. It almost seems like the bats are kind of like their pets, like they're just part of Regalia. And this helps to make that really clear. Like, Regalia can't just decide to include bats in their war and their quests. They have to go and discuss this with Queen Athena of the Bats. And the bats do agree. They are allies. But then they go to the crawlers or the roaches. And at first the roaches disagree because they're at peace with the rats and the humans, and they don't really want to risk angering the rats. So Vicus asks them to reconsider. And that night, Gregor sees them worshipping boots in this, like, ritual called the ring dance. And they only do this for ones that they believe are chosen. The only other human they've done this for is Bartholomew Sandwich. And the next day, they agree to send 2 roaches, Temp and Tick. I love Temp. I love him so much. And then there's also this interesting detail, which is that Boots can tell the roaches apart, even though no one else can. So she definitely has, like, a special role or relationship to the roaches, but, like, and this comes up a lot. It comes up a lot that the roaches think that Boots is interesting and like special and like a princess, but like they never explain why or anything, which is like, I don't know. I was like rereading this and like, oh right, I remember they like her, but like I don't remember why. I'm sure I'll figure it out later. And they don't ever tell you why, unless if I missed it, but I don't think I did. But anyways, that's the roaches. Then they go to the spiders. But on the way, they're attacked by rats, and Vicus kind of pushes Gregor and Boots into like a spider tunnel and is like, go, we'll deal with the rats. They're able to kill the rats, but I'll come back to this moment later. Unfortunately for our quester Gregor, these spiders are like, no. And so they try to eat Gregor, and then he's like, wait, Vicus sent me. So then they don't eat him. They just make him like their prisoner. And then Vicus and the others come. They are able to speak to Queen Vivox, and she's like, I don't want to go on the quest. So you're actually our political prisoners now. So sorry. But they're able to escape due to Boots like throwing a temper tantrum. And they have to like recoup and like figure out what to do now because the quest calls for spinners. And nasty little Henry is like, we should have just kidnapped them. And we don't like Henry because, again, he is rude and very disparaging to all the other species. He calls roaches stupid. He says we want to kidnap spiders. He does some other stuff later down the line. Not nice. And Gregor even notices that when Luxa is with him, she is a lot meaner. So while they're recouping, they're trying to figure out their strategy. Vicus is like, you are about to be very mad at me. He's like, do you remember the rat ambush? That was actually planned. And do you remember the line in the prophecies that says one gnar beside? That means that you have to have a rat with you. And the rat that's going to be with you is the rat that kind of like set up that ambush. And his name is Ripred. So Ripred is easily one of the best characters in the whole series. He is so layered. He is so awesome. I love his character. He wants to restore peace with the humans and the rats. And his motives are not known for a lot of the series. It's kind of like up in the air for a bit. He's definitely not like a good guy, but he does want peace. He's incredibly tough and rude and crass, but he's dependable and he's a very good fighter. And we'll talk about that more later. So in the same interview I mentioned in the back of the book copy that I have, Suzanne Collins is asked which character she would invite to dinner, and she says Ripred, and I agree. I would love to have dinner with Ripred. But anyways, Vicus is like, okay, so here's Ripred, and I'm gonna head out because I'm not mentioning the quest, so bye. So then all the questers head out, and he's like, hopefully you guys will just like find 2 spinners on your way, like whatever, you just have to head out. So for our questers, we have Ripred, Gregor, Boots, Henry, Luxa, Aurora, Ares, so the 2 bats, and then the 2 roaches, Temp and Tick. And they set off to find Gregor's dad. Not long after they head out, they find 2 spiders who were looking to join them, and they join the quest, although one named Triflex died immediately after joining them. So this is like the first person to die. And they had joined because an army of about like 700 rats invaded the spider kingdom not long after the humans left. The spiders held them off and they forced the rats to retreat, but a lot of rats and a lot of spiders died. And after the fight, Vicus came back to the spinners, and Queen Vivox was like, okay, we'll come. We'll try to defeat the rats with you. And so she sent 2 of the spinners along to the questers. But again, one of them died, so now they only have 1. So they keep going, but one night, horrible little Henry tries to kill dearest little Ripred. But thankfully, Gregor steps in. He stops this. Both Henry and Ripred are injured, but they're able to carry on. So finally, they're able to find Gregor's dad in the Rats' Land, and this is where the last paragraph of the prophecy really starts to make sense. Because when they go to leave and return to Regalia with Gregor's dad, we have something interesting happen. We must fly now, Gregor, insisted Luxa. We shall heal him properly in Regalia. Henry, help me secure him. She tried to tie his dad to Aurora with a length of silk that Gox, the spider, was rapidly spinning. Henry, said Luxa again. But Henry stood apart from them, not helping, not hurrying, not even bothering to seem anxious. No, Luxa, we have no need to hurry now. It was a strange answer, and no one understood what he was saying except Ripred. An odd look crossed the rat's face. No, I believe Henry has taken care of everything. Henry had to, said Henry. He lifted his fingers to his lips and gave a long whistle. Are you crazy? What are you doing? Asked Gregor. He looked at Luxa, who seemed to have turned to marble. The silk rope slipped from her hands and fell to the ground. The patter of many rat feet came at them down the road. What was going on? What had Henry done? Ripred, said Gregor. It seems I am not the only spy among us, Overlander, said Ripred wryly, a member of the royal family. You mean Henry? Gregor would never in a million years have believed Henry to be a spy for the rats. They had killed his parents, his people. He can't be, blurted out Gregor. He can't. I mean, what about Luxa? The 2 were so tight. Sorry, cousin, he said urgently to Luxa, but I had no choice. We are headed for disaster under Vicus. He would ally us to the weakest when our only real chance of survival is to ally ourselves with those who are most powerful. We will join forces with the rats and rule together, you and I. Luxa spoke more calmly than Gregor had ever heard her. Not now, Henry, not ever. You must, Luxa. You have no choice. You must join with us or die, said Henry coldly, but there was a tremor in his voice. This is as good a day as any, said Luxa, perhaps better. She sounded 1,000 years old and 1,000 miles away, but she did not sound scared. So Henry betrayed them. Also, there's a note about Ripred being a spy, just to clarify that Ripred was a spy for the humans. He's a rat that, is obviously helping the humans. So King Gorger shows up, and it seems like our questers are kind of shit out of luck, but then Gregor is like, wait, I have to jump off the cliff like the prophecy says. So he leaps pretty much off the cliff to help everybody else and to help Boots get away. The rats chase him, and this causes the edge of the cliff to collapse, sending King Gorger, Henry, and a bunch of the rats off the edge as well. Ares, the bat who was bonded to Henry, dives down and catches him. Doesn't catch Henry though, he catches Gregor, and he swears to Gregor that he had no idea that Henry was a spy, and after this, the living members, beside Ripred, they head back to Regalia. So the four that died were the two spiders, Tick, who died to save Boots, so that was like this thing that I didn't mention, but Rip Tick, but Temp's still kicking, we love Temp, and then Henry. And that is what that last paragraph of the prophecy is referring to, the look, make sure he bids where he leaps, whatever. That's about Henry. So when they return to Regalia, they learn that following King Gorger's death, the rats are in kind of total disarray. They don't have their leader. They have fallen back to their land, essentially ending the war. Additionally, Ripred is trying to gather some followers and kind of make a claim for leadership within this disarray. Gregor's dad explains that the rats did indeed keep him alive in the hopes that that he could invent weapons for them, but he only ever invented flimsy weaponry that kept breaking when the rats tried to use them. Regalia is very shocked by Henry's treachery, but despite that, the council still tries to banish Ares because he abandoned his bond, and like I said, letting your bond die on purpose and not saving them is a super serious thing, and Gregor is like, what the F? No. So then Gregor bonds with Ares, and because Gregor is the warrior, he is super important, they kind of just leave it at that and they let it fly. But after this, Ares is kind of shunned by everybody, especially most of the bats. So finally, after all this, Gregor, Boots, and his dad are able to go home through another tunnel that lets out in Central Park. So book one took a long time to cover because there's so much to set up. The other books will move more quickly, but before we move on to book two, let's just take a minute to kind of recap the politics so far. So Bartholomew of Sandwich in the 1600s moved 800 people down to the Underland. The roaches, they respected him and thought he was a chosen one. The bats very quickly allied themselves with the humans, and we're not clear yet how other species felt about the humans at the time. We'll come back to that, but we do know that the humans felt very threatened, and that's why they built Regalia the way that they did, with defense in mind. During Vicus and Solovit's childhood, the humans lived in relative peace with the rats. But what could have happened to change that? So interesting. Maybe we'll find out. During the time of the first book, the humans are closely allied with the bats, although they still have to come to kind of new agreements regarding big political shifts like war or quests. And the roaches are decently peaceful with the humans pre-Gregor's arrival, and they trade with them, although at the start they trade with anyone. The roaches don't really care for offense, they're a lot more about the defense. But within the first book, this does change because the roaches do start to ally themselves more closely with the humans because they have this high regard for Boots. The spiders, a lot like the roaches, they seem to trade with anyone. They do care kind of somewhat for politics. They don't outright eat diplomats or politicians like Vicus, but they're a lot more in the air, although after this first book, they do start to ally themselves more closely with the humans after the rats attack their kingdom. This is kind of a trend that we'll see a lot. There are several insect species that are very non-involved with the politics, or they're kind of involved on a case-by-case basis. The rats, of course, are the main enemies of humans and Regalia at the start of the book. They make use of spies and technological developments to try to gain an edge over the humans, and when King Gorger is leading the rats, he desperately wants to be more human, he desperately wants a thumb and wants better weapons, and he is kind of given this guy from the Golden Compass. So by the end of the book, the Rat Kingdom is really in flux, and Ripred is trying to become a leader to the rats. Regalia's future is similarly in flux, although to a much lesser degree. During this book, Regalia is led by council and mainly by Vicus. Queen Luxa is queen, but as she is only 11, she is really she's not like officially ruling. So she still is very important, but she's not officially ruling. And then her grandmother, Solivet, is in charge of military strategy. So let's see what book 2 brings. So when I mentioned this map created by Catherine Sobol, I mentioned that you guys should stay tuned for the end of the book. So I kept talking about how Henry is a bit nasty and a little horrible. And I kept saying that, I kept talking about it because, you know, everybody likes a little bit of a villain when they can have a redemption arc. Unfortunately, in this book series, Henry does not get that. He does die at the end of book 1. Spoiler, he doesn't come back or anything. He is dead at the end of book 1. But Catherine has written an incredibly amazing series of books that she's still working on that are Underland Chronicle fanfictions. She made this map as part of her fanfiction work, and they are really, really good. I am almost done with the first book. I'm really excited to read more, and the plot of these is about Henry. Henry's the main character, and the concept, the first book starts off where the actual first book, Gregor the Overlander, where the canon book ends. And the concept is, what if Henry had survived the fall? And it is, I mean, it's just such a good concept. I think it's such a good concept. It's one that you kind of think to yourself throughout the story. It's so good. Her books, I mean, I'm really, really enjoying reading them. It's so nice if you want to like spend more time in the Underland, because it totally feels seamless. It feels very much like you're in the same world. It's not jarring. It very much aligns with the Underland that you know already. It feels very canon. I started reading it while I was still reading these, and then I had to pause and finish the series and finish my script, because I was like, if I keep reading these, I'm going to get confused with like the canon line of events. So that can just like give you an idea of like how much it matches the vibe and the feeling of the canon books. So if you are interested in reading them, please check out the link in my description. If you read them, give her a review on Goodreads, especially if you like them. It takes so much work to write a book, and I have so much respect for fan fiction writers, because writing is hard. Writing when writing for fun and for a fan fiction audience can be such a thankless job, and I think it's a shame, because these are really works of art. So definitely check them out if you're interested. If you like fan fiction, if you like Gregor the Overlander, check out the description and click on them and read them. But on to book 2. So the second book, Gregor and the Prophecy of Bane, starts out with Gregor being back in the Overland, and in the 5 or 6 months since the first book, since he returned with his father, things have not improved as much at home as he hoped they would. So his father has been really sick with an Underland illness, and doctors in the Overland don't really know what's wrong, and they can't help him or heal him. Money is stretched really thin. This is something I didn't really mention in the first book, but this is something that we do know about Gregor's family. I'm not going to talk too much about Gregor's family or like what's going on in the Overland with his family, but we do know that money is pretty tight. They mentioned a couple times that he works at his neighbor's apartment, Mrs. Cormachi. But yeah, money is stretched especially thin, especially now given that it's the holidays. So Gregor has started doing that work for his older neighbor, Mrs. Cormachi. She's an old widow, and so she kind of gets Gregor to help her move things and stuff like that. And she also definitely just kind of wants to help out the family. It's pretty obvious from their interactions that she's kind of looking for kind and socially acceptable ways to just give them money without making the family feel embarrassed. To distract from the tough times at home, Gregor takes Boots sledding in Central Park, but she gets kidnapped by some crawlers, and I mean the Underland crawlers, and she gets taken back to the Underland. So Gregor has to follow her down. So once he's back in Regalia, he learns that the Roaches did sort of a national treasure thing where they kidnapped Boots before the rats could kill her. But why do they want to kill her? Well, the prophecy of Bane. Now what is that? Let's look. If under fell and over leaped, if life was death, if death life reaped, Something rises from the gloom to make the underland a tomb. Hear it scratching down below, rat of long forgotten snow. Evil cloaked in coat of white, will the warrior drain your light? What could turn the warrior weak? What do burning gnawers seek? Just a barely speaking pup who holds the land of under up. Die the baby, die his heart, die his most essential part. Die the peace that rules the hour, gnawers have their key to power. So they talk with like Vicus and stuff, and essentially this prophecy, like the rats are trying to kill Boots before Gregor kills the Bane. So this prophecy basically says that like if like with the die the baby, die his heart, die his most essential part, that's like the Gnar's key to power. If they kill Boots, if they kill the baby, then they kill his heart. He won't be able to kill the Bane, and the rats will like still be able to like rule with the Bane. So yeah. So Vicus is like, look, you can take Boots back to the Overland if you really want, but I absolutely promise you that the rats will kill her. And he, like, this is kind of interesting. The underland roaches have the overland roaches, like normal roaches, they have them spying on the family. And it's like, he's like, Vicus is like, and I promise you the rats do the same. So I thought this is like really interesting because it kind of seems like all of the overland species talk to the underland species of the same variety, which is so interesting to me. But anyways, Gregor's like, okay, fine, I'll kill this Bane, and then we're going home. So boys, pack it up, we're going on another quest. But before the quest, we gotta prep. And part of this prep is that Gregor will need to train. And this introduces a really interesting conflict that we're going to see for the rest of the book series. So Vicus does not want Gregor to train. Remember, he's a diplomat. He's sort of our stand-in for like peace. His character is always promoting that. So he doesn't want Gregor to train. And he thinks that since Gregor did not really need a weapon last time, and since he used his other weapons like wit and whatever, that like he doesn't need to learn how to fight. And Solivet, as a military leader, she's like, no, she disagrees. And she sets up training for Gregor without even telling Vicus. And Gregor overhears the two of them arguing about this in private, but he doesn't really think much of it. And this is the second instance of where we see somebody who thinks that Vicus is a bit too meek in his strategy. Obviously we had Henry commit treason, in part because he saw Vicus looking to make diplomatic relations between himself, the roaches, other species that Henry thought were too weak, and he thought that that weakened the humans. And Solivet, like, she kind of feels the same way. She feels like it's weak on Vicus's part, and like he's not like reading the room, essentially. Like, no, Gregor needs to train, he's the warrior. They have a line in the first book saying like the prophecy calls for the warrior, not the peacemaker. He needs to train. So Gregor goes to training, and here he meets some of Luxa's other cousins. So Henry and Nerissa are the only royal cousins, but on her non-royal side she has some cousins who live at a place called the Fount, and these are Howard, Stellavet, Hero, Kent, and somebody named Chimney. This is actually kind of funny because Gregor isn't sure about her name, and it's almost like we're like, oh, okay, well, we'll hear it later. We'll hear what her actual name is, but like we don't. Besides, I don't know. So Stellavet, they set her up. We learn that Stellavet is super cruel. She makes a lot of rude little comments alluding to Henry and his betrayal to Luxa. And we also learn that Stellavet kind of wants the throne for herself, but she's decently far away from it. Although Luxa's like, no, it's not impossibly far. And I think, again, some of this stuff is really funny. Sometimes in this book series, I think this book series is great. I will say I think it's a little bit less meticulously planned out because there's a couple of like things that are set up that you're like, that'll totally come back later, especially in these first two books, and it never comes back. Like the first one I mentioned was like Boots being like a roach princess. That literally never comes back. Or like why she's special, why she can tell them apart. Like that never comes back. We don't ever learn why, unless if I've missed something big. And then the other thing that definitely doesn't come back is all of these cousins that we learn, that like we meet, whatever. The only one that really matters is Howard. So I guess that was a storyline that maybe was going to go another way, but I don't know. We don't meet anybody. we don't really see anybody else again except for Howard. So speaking of Luxa, she's looking really rough. Like she was understandably destroyed after Henry's betrayal and after his death. But the big surprise during this training is that Gregor is good at it. Like scary good at it. During a drill with these like blood balls where they like throw them at him and he has to like, the person has to like hit them with their sword. Howard and Luxa hit 7 out of 15 of them, just to give you like a ballpark of what really good like warrior or fighter or whatever will hit. Gregor goes into a trance, and on his first try he hits 15 out of 15, and this really freaks him out. Like after this he starts like hyperventilating, he gets on Aries' back, and like they kind of go to like the secret little cave where he can kind of collect himself, because he just feels like he's not himself in this trance. He kind of barely remembers it, and he just feels super out of control. And Luxa manages to calm him down a bit, but he doesn't really share the extent of how this experience felt or why it freaked him out so much. And I love this trait. This is going to be the start of a pretty big aspect of the story, and especially a big aspect thematically. But I think it's a really like poignant intro to Gregor's fighting skills. Typically, like when we have, especially like a boy protagonist, when they're really good at fighting unexpectedly, they feel really cool, they feel really powerful, and maybe it's not till later on that they realize like, oh, there's responsibility that comes with, you know, being able to kill or attack that well. And with Gregor, this terrifies him immediately, and it makes him feel sick, and it makes him feel disgusted with himself and scared of himself. And I think that that's really mature, and like I said, it's the start of something really interesting. So soon after this, Rip Red arrives in Regalia with another rat named Twitch Tip. And Twitch Tip, I really like a lot of the kind of non-enemy rat characters that we meet. She is what's called a sensier. So this means that she has an insane sense of smell, and she can smell like color, she can smell your secrets, she can really smell it all. And this freaks the rats out so much that they banish her to the Deadlands, and that's where she met Rip Red. So last time we checked in with Rip Red at the end of book 1, he was going to start gathering sympathizers so that he could try to kind of become the leader of the rats, and that's been going okay. Like there are some people that have moved out to the Deadlands with him that follow him, but he still does live in the Deadlands. Like he doesn't live within the actual rat kingdom. He's still very much like a fringe counter culture, counter political group, but you know, it's going okay. And he told Twitch Tip that she can stay with him and live in the Deadlands only if she helps Gregor fulfill this prophecy and kill a Bane. So that's why she's here. Also following the war in book 1, Solivet and the humans have cut off the rats from their main fishing grounds, and they are starving. Rip Red does not agree with this, and he tells Solivet as much, and he says that this is going to work against them in the long run, and that this is not a smart move politically in the long run. And that is really interesting. We'll definitely come back to that. We'll hear this fact mentioned several times. And in the first book, we didn't really like get to meet Solivet so much. Gregor thought she was a bit intimidating, but very like smart and whatever. She is ruthless, and this is where we start to see that. Also, interestingly enough, that is a war crime, cutting off them from their feeding grounds. So anyways, that's that. Rip Red tries to teach Gregor echolocation, since his dependence on light is so crippling, but Gregor sucks at this. We'll come back to echolocation later. So after this prep period, they head out on our quest and here are questers. Gregor, Boots, Howard, Marith, Temp, Love Temp, Twitch Tip, Aries, Pandora, and Andromeda. Notably missing from this are Luxa and her bond. Aurora, they're not allowed to go because, again, Luxa is royalty. The only reason she was allowed on the last quest is because she was specifically named, but it is way too risky for her to go. She is pissed about this. And then we also have Zap and Photos Glogo, who are 2 shiners, aka 2 fireflies. Fireflies are basically the epitome of that, like, insect thing I mentioned earlier, where, like, there's a lot of insects in the Underland that, like, pretty much just, like, only do stuff when it benefits them. So Photos Glogo and Zap, they basically work for the highest bidder, and they're really gluttonous, so all they want is food. So that's the quest. Well, the last quest had them flying. This one has them sailing. That's why they need Zap and Photos Glogo, because it's too long of a journey to take like torches and torch materials, so they need like fireflies. It's not long before they meet their first threat, which is a giant squid that attacks the boat. They escape this relatively unharmed, thankfully, although Gregor does get knocked out for like 2 days. And when he wakes up, Luxa and Aurora are there because they were like, screw this, screw Vicus, I'm going. And they flew out, and now it's too far for them to like fly back to Regalia safely, and Luxa planned it that way because she's smart. So everybody's really mad about this, but they don't really have time to think about it because they are soon coming across their second threat, and it's quite a bit more dangerous. Basically, they're sailing along, and Twitch Trip is like, wait, the water ahead, it smells wrong, but she can't put a name to it. The bats are able to lift one of the boats out of the water, and they leave the boat with Howard and Twitch Tip, and then Howard's bat goes back to save him, and Gregor's like, so you guys are really just gonna leave my girl Twitch Tip over there? I'm not gonna do that. So he ties a rope to himself, drops down into the maelstrom, and saves her. Because he's a warrior, and because he's a good person, and because he's not prejudiced against the rats. After this, Gregor is really, really disgusted with Luxa and Howard and Meredith, since they were just going to leave Twitch Tip to die. And he says to Luxa, he's like, look, just because you help a rat does not mean that you're like Henry, and nobody, like, it, you know, it's not that big of a deal. And Luxa is like, well, just because you see it that way does not mean that everybody else is going to see it that way. And I feel like that's such a great reminder of the weight that is on Luxa's shoulders at this point, because even though she seems a little bit reckless, she also has to think about how her kingdom sees her. And I think that that was part of her motivation in coming out on this quest when she's not supposed to, because she wants Regalia to see that she's fighting for them. And that's worth risking her life for. Meredith and a lot of other people, I'm sure, really disagree, because if Luxa dies, then that would leave Nerissa on the throne at this point. And Nerissa, like I mentioned, is very, very frail and not seen as sane. So they're mad at her for coming because of that, but like, she's there now, so it's done. So after Twitch Tip gets saved by Gregor, she tells him that she can smell that he is a rager. And he's like, and a rager is basically just like a really, really good fighter. Rip Red, who I mentioned is a really good fighter, he's one of these too. And it's basically somebody with like an instinct to fight. It's like, I don't know. It's just somebody who's like a really, really exceptionally good fighter. They go into those like rager mode. I don't know how to explain it. I feel like this is, I can't think of any examples of media that use this, but I feel like it's kind of a common trope. But yeah, and Gregor, again, he has that same feeling he has before. Like, he is disgusted. He doesn't want to be a warrior. He doesn't want to kill the Bane, even though that's what the prophecy says. He's already upset about that and feels disgusted about it. And now he's being told that he's like almost biologically designed to kill. Like, that is really rough. He's really struggling with that. And he makes Twitch Tip like promise not to tell anybody, and he's embarrassed about this and disgusted by it and doesn't want anybody to know. So the next thing that they come across is an island, and they're like, ooh, we don't know this island, let's do some recon. There are some yummy mites that maybe the bats can eat. And Temp is like, don't go there. But nobody listens to Temp. I didn't mention this last time, but when Tick died, the other roach, it was also an instance where they didn't listen to Temp. And here they are not listening to Temp, and nobody listens to my boy Temp. So anyways, Pandora, Howard's Bond, flies to the island. Ares is following her, and then Pan, when she gets over the island, she literally gets like shredded by mites. Like, immediately becomes a skeleton, and she is dead and gone. And Ares is able to escape with a few bites, but Howard is beside himself with grief. Like I mentioned, they're bonds, and bonding is like it's a close bond. So Howard is like so beside himself. He's like trying to save her. Dude, she's a skeleton. Like, she is, it's not going to happen. Okay, I don't think there's nothing you can do at this point. Meredith has to like knock him out basically to like save him from trying to go into the water or whatever. But yeah, I tell you, if they would just listen to Temp, there would be a lot fewer deaths in this series. I wish I had counted. I think we're up to like, we can start counting now. I think we're up to like 2. That's like 2 deaths if they had listened to Temp, because I think I'm right. I think Tick died because they didn't listen to him. I might be wrong about that though. So they approach this area called the Tankard. This is where they're supposed to go. It's a scary pit with big sea snakes that is like near the labyrinth, which is where the Bane is. So they approach the Tankard, and the Shiners, like I mentioned, they're really only working for the highest bidder. They abandon our little squad of questers because they ran out of food, and they're like, okay, bye. And not only do they do that, they go to the rats and like sell them the info that our questers are there. So our squad is like, shit, that's like what's happening right now. So, yeah. So now they have very little light, and the rats will soon know the whereabouts. So they get into the tankard, and the rats are there because they knew the squad was coming, and they start throwing boulders into the water to wake these giant sea serpents that live at the bottom of the tankard. This works. There's a huge fight. Howard, Meredith, Andromeda, Ares, Twitch Trip, and Gregor get separated from Luxa, Aurora, Boots, and Temp. Twitch Trip's nose is badly damaged, and she can't smell. And also I think Meredith loses his leg. So before this damage to her nose, she smelled what happened to Luxa and Boots and the others. They went under, and she never smelled them coming back up. So the prophecy, that part of the prophecy has happened, and Boots is dead. Gregor's obviously, like, he does not have time to process this. He's devastated, but he does not have time to process this because, again, Meredith is badly wounded. So Gregor forces Andromeda to take him and Howard back to Regalia. Since Luxa is dead too, Howard needs to be back so that somebody can tell them that Luxa is dead. And also, like, Howard, he's not royal, but he's high enough up, like, he can kind of help this transition to Nerissa because she's gonna have to take the throne now. So Gregor and Ares, they head out with Twitch Tip guiding them through the labyrinth based on the last of what she remembered before her nose was damaged. Eventually, though, she has to stop because she's no longer, like, she's at the end of that kind of mental scent map, and also she's really badly injured. So they leave her there, and Gregor and Ares head on. Love my girl Twitch Tip. So Gregor sees two rats, and he's about to fight them, but then they start fighting each other. These are actually the Bane's parents, and they fight to the death because the Bane's mom did not want him to be raised by his father. And in her dying breath, she asks Gregor to not kill the Bane. And Gregor's like, weird. So they keep going and they find the Bane. But here's the rub. He is just a little baby rat pup, a baby. And he's crying for his mom, who Gregor just watched die. So Gregor is like, I can't kill a baby. He, like, can't do it. So he decides, him and Ari agree to take the baby to Rip Red instead. And after a bit of an argument with Rip Red in the Deadlands, he agrees to raise the Bane. And Gregor and Ares head back to Regalia. So right when they get back, Nerissa is being crowned queen since Howard brought back the bad news about Luxa. And Nerissa is so frail that she faints when she sees Gregor. And this is obviously concerning to the Regalian citizens. They're like, oh my god, Gregor, like, you totally found the Bane, right? He's like, yes. And funny story, I gave it to Rip Red. And they immediately try him for treason. And actually, they try everybody on the quest for treason except for Meredith, since he was unconscious. So Ares, Andromeda, and Howard are all on trial for treason for not fulfilling this mission. And he tells the whole story during the trial. And when he gets to the part about the Bane being a baby, Nerissa's like, oh my god, a baby? Tell me you didn't kill it. And he's like, no, that's kind of like what the whole thing's about. And she's like, okay, good thing you didn't kill it, because if you did, then that would have spelled the doom in the prophecy. So essentially what she's saying is that part that's like, die the baby, die his heart, die his most essential part. Like, that says that if the baby dies and his most essential part dies, then, you know, the humans would fall. She's saying that this actually is not about Boots, that it is about the Bane, and that if Gregor killed the Bane, he'd be killing off the good part about himself, and that would have triggered a war and sent the Overland into a spiral, or the Underland into a spiral. So they're no longer on trial while the council evaluates this possibility, and then surprise, Boots is not dead. Somehow she survived, and Temp carried her until a moth carried her the rest of the way to the Crawlers' colony. So the Crawlers were not able to go back and find Temp after this. They were not able to find Luxa, but the only one that they found was Boots. So my boy Temp saved Boots. They don't know how she survived because, again, she's like an infant, so she's not really like a toddler, not an infant, she's a toddler, so she's not really like telling them anything helpful. But after this, Vicus kind of rushes the two of them back to the Overland just in case the council decides to reverse Nerissa's judgment and kind of try them for treason again. So before they leave, Nerissa slips a copy of a different prophecy into Gregor's pocket, and they head home. So let's get into some of the takeaways of this book. Honestly, this one is probably my least favorite of the series, because it's still a little bit of exposition. This becomes evident when we get to books 4 and 5, where like 4 and 5 is really what the whole series is setting us up for. But I don't know, something about this one is just a little boring to me. But that being said, it does set up some of those really important tensions. So we meet some of these other species like the moths and the fireflies, and they're kind of wild cards. So the moth came in pretty much at the end. I think they're called like the flutterers or something. I don't know what they're called. I forget their name, but they're kind of like allies with the roaches. So they kind of help Boots here at Temp's request. But like I said, they're kind of wild cards like most of the insects. They don't really have super strong allegiances with the mammals, and they make most of their decisions based on money, trade, or political protection. Obviously, the rats are still the ones going through the most change right now since their king was killed in book 1. After this, they started to look to the Bane, who was born pretty soon after King Gorger's death, since he was prophesied to become their leader. But now he's in the care of Rip Red, who is politically on the fringe with the traditional rat leadership. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. The other thing with the rats is that they're still really hurting from the events of book 1. As I mentioned, after that war battle or whatever it was in book 1, their land has been really reduced and they've been blocked from these key fishing grounds and they are starving. So it's not a good time to be a rat. And I think it's really important to note too that this land that they took, and this is why the map is so important, in my opinion, it's really important to visualize stuff like this, is that this land that they blocked them from is not what the original conflict was about, and it doesn't even border Regalia. The main point of this move that's all of that made was to starve the rats. It's not incidental. That is literally the rationale. She makes that move to punish the rats, and she's punishing all of them. All of the rats, including their pups, are starving. And that's important to know that that's happening in the background right now. And this brings us to the humans. Obviously, we have Luxa dying and Nerissa becoming queen, which is politically not actually a massive deal because the council is ruling, not Luxa. Of course, this change has a lot of effects on the morale of Regalia, and even though Luxa wasn't technically ruling, she obviously had a lot of clout and was a key political player in Regalia. The main shift, though, that we see in this book is how Gregor, and by extension the reader, is starting to see the humans. In the first book, he's so focused on his dad, and he kind of automatically allies himself with the humans. He doesn't really question anything about how the humans act and why they do what they do. He questions Henry a little bit, thinks Henry's rude, doesn't like the way he talks about them. But in this book, he's starting to question it. He takes issue with the fact that Luxa and Howard try to abandon Twitch Tip. He thinks that it's really cruel that Solivet is starving the rats, and he's starting to see a little more of these deeper political tensions and how the humans are playing a role in creating a lot of cruelty in the underworld. Especially at the end of this book, with him and the other questers being tried for treason. That is appalling to him. He's like, these people just put their lives on the line. I just put my life on the line. I don't have to be doing this just because it's prophesized, but I'm here and trying to help because I thought I was doing the right thing. And so this idea of Gregor realizing human cruelty is definitely a thread that we're going to be following, and we're really going to see it pick up in the next book. Gregor and the Curse of the Warmbloods is book 3. Let's get into it. Remember when I said at the end of book 2 that Nerissa put a copy of a prophecy in Gregor's pocket before he left? Well, that was unfortunately the prophecy of blood. So since returning to the Overland, Gregor has been thinking about this prophecy and also anxiously waiting on any news from Vicus and from the Underland, because he's hoping to hear something about Luxa, something like maybe she's been found, anything. So finally he gets word from Vicus saying, hey, the prophecy of blood is upon us and I need you down here bad. So Gregor and his dad, they head down there and they learn that a really bad plague sorry this book series is so unintentionally topical, it's actually very depressing. Although I guess this was kind of written around the earlier SARS outbreak in the early 2000s. I don't know. But anyways, a bad plague is affecting the mammals or the Warmbloods, and that Ares is actually one of the few cases with this plague in Regalia. And since the prophecy of blood calls for the warrior to find the cure, Gregor needs to come. So let's take a look at the prophecy. So I'm going to read the prophecy, but one thing that is important to mention is that this prophecy is actually written backwards. So Gregor is only able to read it in a mirror, and we'll come back to this later. But here's the prophecy. Warmblood now, a bloodborne death, will rob your body of its breath. Mark your skin and seal your fate, the underland becomes a plate. Turn and turn and turn again, you see the what but not the when. Remedy and wrong entwine, and so they form a single vine. Bring the warrior from above, if yet his heart is swayed by love. Bring the princess or despair, no crawlers care without her there. Turn and turn and turn again, you see the what but not the when. Remedy and wrong entwine, and so they form a single vine. Those whose blood runs red and hot must join to seek the healing spot. In the cradle find the cure for that which makes the blood impure. Turn and turn and turn again, you see the what but not the when. Remedy and wrong entwine, and so they form a single vine. Gnaw humors, I can't read these. Gnaw human set aside the hatreds that reside inside. If the flames of war are fanned, all the Warmbloods lose the underland. Turn and turn and turn again, you see the what but not the when. Remedy and wrong entwine, and so they form a single vine. Yeah, so I mentioned that it's backwards. And also there's that repeating line, that repeating paragraph, verse, whatever it's called, and they don't really know what that means. But in the cradle find the cure, so they're trying to go to the place where the thing is from. But anyways, we'll talk about the rest of this prophecy later, but the important part is that it calls for the warrior and it calls for the princess, because the crawlers don't care without her there. So we will talk more about that. So since the prophecy mentions Boots the princess, he's like, okay, well, there's no way my mom is going to let Boots down here. So him and his dad, because again, his dad came down here with him, they head back up, and his mom is like, hell no, you're not going, and you're not bringing your toddler sister down there again. Understandably, but remember that weird connection between the underland animals and the overland animals? Basically, the overland rats get message from the underland rats, and they try to kill Gregor's family. So his mom's like, okay, fine, you can go. But Gregor's mom is like, I'm coming too. Not a good move in hindsight. We'll see that later. The three of them come down there. They start to look into the plague more. They learn a little bit more. The plague victims are Howard, Andromeda, and Ares. Those are the three in Regalia. Ares is looking the worst. And they're under the care of Dr. Naviv, who is able to help them manage some of their symptoms and try to keep them alive for as long as possible so that they can carry out this quest and find the cure. Dr. Naviv is also going to work on a cure while Gregor goes on the quest just in case they can't find it or something. So Ares is looking the worst because he has had it the longest. They think that he contracted it when he was bitten by those mites over that island on the last quest. And it's a miracle that Gregor didn't catch it because he was flying on Ares the whole way back. And it's super contagious between Warmbloods. So wow, what a miracle. Prophecy calls for all the Warmbloods to go on this quest, meaning the humans, the rats, and the bats. Hi, Lily. This is Lily. Hey, baby. Hey. Hey. Okay, bye. She just wants to chill. But the prophecy calls for all the Warmbloods to go on the quest, so the humans, the rats, the bats, the mice, and the reps from each species. Hi, baby. They gather to discuss the plan. Unfortunately, though, the rats, Lapblood, and Mange were supposed to get word to the mice about this, but they didn't because they didn't spend all that effort driving the nibblers from their land, nibblers are mice, to have them join them on this quest. And if the mice die of the plague, good riddance. That's not very nice. Hi, come up. Hi. I don't think you can really maybe you can see her tail. But regardless, Dr. Naviv explains that the cure comes from a plant called starshade, which only grows on a jungle island in the Valley of the Eyes. And that's where the plague comes from. Remember, in the cradle find the cure. So everyone is really scared. No, Lily. Everyone's really scared of this place. And that's why the rats drove the mice there when they were just doing just a little spot of ethnic cleansing. So Lapblood and Mange are also like, well, we're not so convinced that the rats are going to go on this quest. Why would we come on this quest when you hate the rats? You will probably never give us any of the cure. And even now you have anti-flea powder. The fleas help spread the plague, like fleas do in real life. And you won't share. And we are still starving because you cut off access to that river. But during these negotiations, a plague-ridden bat falls into the meeting hall and exposes them, infecting Gregor's mom. So now Gregor really has to go on this quest and find the cure. So they are deciding who the questers are. They want Gregor, Boots, Nike, who is a flyer, because Ares is really sick, Solivet, her bond, Ajax, Ripred, Mange and Lapblood, who are rats, and Temp for the crawlers. Love Temp. They did find Temp, so he is alive following the events of book 2. Yay, Temp! So Lapblood and Mange are like, okay, but like, we're still not convinced that we're going. Despite this agreement, and Solivet is like, we'll open the fishing grounds again that you know, we borrowed you from, and they're like, well, send us some of that anti-fleet powder if you mean business. And finally she agrees after a lot of turmoil, and this is like a really, really big deal for a lot of the humans. Like, some of them are so pissed off that they're crying. One guy leaves the meeting, and Gregor is like, dude, what the fuck? Like, this is a plague, you know? Public Health 101, it benefits all of us to help fight it and help stop other people from getting it. And he just does not understand why these anti-rat sentiments are so strong. So before they leave, Nerissa mentions that she arranged for them to meet a guide in the jungle. And they're all like, when did this girl have time to arrange that? They head to the jungle along with Vicus, who's just going along to meet the guide. He's not going on the whole quest. But who is this guide, you ask? Well, it's Luxa's dead uncle. He's not dead. He was thought to be dead. His name is Hamnet. And his half-lander child named Hazard. So Hamnet is Vicus and Solivet's son. And Vicus is very, very emotional. I mean, they thought he was dead. But Solivet is being kind of a bitch as per usual. And Hamnet is like, I will be your guide on this quest as long as Solivet is not here. So after a lot of fighting, Solivet agrees to leave the quest. And before Hamnet leads the rest of these questers on, we have a nice moment that I want to read a little bit of. Also, Hamnet left Regalia a while ago, like 10 years ago, and when he left, Nerissa was like, in 10 years, you must go to this spot and meet these people. And he was like, okay. And so that's why he's here. So she arranged this like forever ago. You may come home at any time. Know this. There are many ways to occupy yourself. You would not have to fight. Vicus, I cannot, stammered Hamnet. You can, only think about it. Think of the child if something should happen to you. Vicus pulled back, almost shaking Hamnet by his shoulders. What do you do here that you could not do there? I do no harm, said Hamnet. I do no more harm. We'll talk about that a bit more later on. And it's obvious there's like some kind of backstory here. So, like on the other quests, after they head out, there is a lot of dangers in the jungle. So they're making their way through these dangers and resting when needed. And one night, Gregor overhears a conversation between Lapblood and Mange. Do you think there's any chance they're still alive? Whispered Lapblood. Not the two little ones. I know they were dying when we left. But Flyfur and Sixclaw? Yes, I do, said Mange soothingly. The yellow powder is on its way, and they had no signs of the plague when we left. And you know Make Mince will manage to feed them somehow. The two little ones. Do you think they suffered much? Said Lapblood. I can't bear to think of them calling me and no one answering. My pups. No, I'm sure they went quickly, said Mange in a choked voice, but we can't think of that. We have to think of Flyfur and Sixclaw. They still have a chance. Yes, I know. I will, said Lapblood. I am. Now go to sleep, Lapblood, said Mange. Please. So Gregor feels really bad, you know, he thinks, you know, it's kind of confusing for him because on the one hand he knows their rats do bad things, but on the other hand, like, they're suffering right now. I mean, they were starving, they're still kind of starving, and now like he's hearing about this and like their pups are being killed by the plague. It's really sad. And to add insult to injury, like, they have to come on this quest to save their babies, but like they have to ally themselves with the humans who are the reason that they're starving and who are the reasons that the plague is so bad, like, for the rats, because again, they had that anti-flea powder and they did not share it or help distribute it or anything like that. So during the trip, as they keep going on the quest, Hazard starts to teach Boots how to speak cockroach because he speaks a lot of different languages. And I think that this is so interesting. Like, they talk about how he's the only human who tries to speak with other species, and all the other species had to learn English to accommodate the humans. And that just, like, I kind of mentioned the language thing before. This is what I was talking about. This helps to paint the picture that the Regalians really don't try to be diplomatic, and they never even made an attempt to learn the other species language. And we'll talk more about language. It comes up at a couple different points, but Hazard is really good at speaking other languages, and so he starts to teach Boots some of these skills. Gregor also starts to think a bit more about diplomacy when he's talking to Hamnet, and Hamnet's talking to him about Gregor's choice to not kill the Bane. One thing I didn't mention about Hamnet is he's also a rager, and we'll talk about that again, but, you know, he's talking about diplomacy with Hamnet, who's also a rager, and Hamnet is like, you know, if you had killed the Bane, the rats would have never agreed to even come on this quest. So Gregor's kind of thinking about that and just like, man, I guess a diplomatic solution was the right ending to that problem. So at some point in this journey, Mange unfortunately dies by a carnivorous plant, and Lapblood is like very, 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 very depressed about this. I mean, poor Lapblood. I mean, her babies are dying. She's not sure if her other 2 babies are alive, and then her mate dies. She just had too much. So they keep journeying on until they come across the ultimate jungle threat, quicksand, and Gregor, Lapblood, and Ripred all get caught in it. And they're like, oh my god, help, help, help. Who appears? Who appears? Luxa, that's right. She is not dead. She does not help Gregor at first because all she sees is him with 2 rats. And she's kind of like, she heard that Gregor didn't kill the Bane, and she's like, oh my god, this bitch pulled a Henry. He betrayed us and joined the rats. Lily, what are you doing? So then Hamnet appears and they save Ripred and Gregor, and Lapblood is like, she just had too much. She just wants to be left to die. But they don't let her die. They save her, and she's so depressed that she refuses to groom herself, which is really important because they were just in quicksand. They have to groom the fur before the quicksand dries in it. And so Gregor grooms her himself, and it is really sweet. It's a really sweet and tender moment. So Gregor obviously clears up the miscommunication with Luxa, and he learns that Twitch Tip helped her escape, helped her and Aurora get out, but she doesn't know what happened to Twitch Tip after that. So they journey on, and Ripred tells Luxa and Gregor what happened with Hamnet and what the deal was at the start of the book with all that kind of like vagueness and like deep family issues. You see, the thing you have to understand is that the humans and the rats were not always so consumed with hatred for each other. At least, the hatred has ebbed and flowed, so there have been periods when one could hope for a genuine peace. These times coincided with both the rats and the humans having leaders that were willing to place a higher priority on harmony than gain. Several hundred years ago, they say, was such a time. As a token of goodwill, the humans gave a gift to the rats, a place the bats had named the Garden of Hesperides. Sandwich's own people had planted the garden soon after they arrived in the underland. There was a small plain that flooded each year when the river was high. The humans built a dike so that the plain would no longer flood, and when it dried, the land was very fertile. They planted apple trees. They were small by overland standards, but sturdy and able to grow with just the light from the river. There were sluice gates along the dike that could be opened and shut to provide water. The trees flourished, and soon their branches were heavy with golden apples. For the rats, it was a rare gift indeed. Unlike the humans, we can't grow crops, but the trees required little care and produced fruit almost continually. When I was a pup, I remember it was a great treat to go to the garden, to eat the apples, to sleep in the cave surrounding it, which smelled as sweet as the fruits. Yes, whispered Lapblood sadly, everyone loved the garden. I've never even heard of the Garden of Hesperides, said Luxa suspiciously. No, because if you had heard of it, you would also have heard the story of why your uncle left, which I will tell you now. 10 or so years ago was not one of those fortunate times. While your father was a decent enough king in some respects, your highness, he was too rigid in others, and of course King Gorger was a bloodthirsty monster from the get-go. Yes, the same King Gorger who fell to his death on your first visit, Gregor. Anyway, the humans decided they wanted the garden back. Solivet sent an army under Hamnet's command to run out the rats. Hamnet at the time was hands down the best warrior among the humans. Everyone assumed he would take control of the army after his mother, since he seemed like her, just like her. But as it turned out, he was as much like Vicus as he was like Solivet, and so he was doomed. Under Hamnet, the humans and their flyers launched a surprise attack. The rats, most of whom were playing in the garden with their pups, were thrown into chaos, but they quickly regrouped, herded the pups into the surrounding caves, and turned to do battle. They fought so viciously that the tide began to turn in their favor, but Hamnet had a backup plan provided by his mother. If the rats should prove too strong, he was to open the sluice gates and flood the field. Then the rats would have to swim, and the humans on flyers would have a great advantage. So Hamnet opened the gates. The river was high, the dike was centuries old. As the water burst through the sluice gates, the surrounding mortar and stone crumbled and the whole dike gave way, not merely flooded in the plain, but reclaiming it under 20 feet of water. Hundreds of rats were drowning in the deluge, and many flyers were caught as well. But the carnage didn't end there. Having filled the plain, the water rushed into the cave entrances, drowning the pups that had been hidden there for safety. You could hear their shrieks for a mile around. Hamnet began a desperate effort to rescue the drownings. Human, rat, bat, rat, whatever, but it was useless. His own flyer, his bond, was dragged into the water by 2 rats trying to save themselves, and she never resurfaced. Hamnet was pulled out by Marith, who had to knock him senseless in order to keep him from diving back into what was this time a lake of corpses. When Hamnet regained consciousness in Regalia, he was for all practical purposes mad. So after this, Hamnet left Regalia after being so disgusted by what he did at his mother's command. So Gregor is... he's obviously very, like, disturbed by this story, and honestly Luxa is too, especially because, like, Luxa's never heard about it. Like, this is, like, such a big deal. She's never heard about it, and now she kind of, like, they kind of understand why Hamnet ran away, and especially for Gregor, it's like, you know, he definitely thinks about this a lot, especially because when Hamnet had said, like, the whole thing, like, the whole reason he came to the jungle, like, when Vicus said, like, what can you do here that you can't do at home? He's like, I do no harm. He doesn't have to fight, he doesn't have to be involved in the politics, and he doesn't have to be used as a weapon to kill. This is something that Gregor already starts to think about a lot, and that really impacts him when he hears the story, because right now he's literally the prophesized warrior, and he's being used as a weapon. They're both ragers, obviously a lot of parallels there. So finally, they reach the Starshade in the valley, but cutters or ants, they show up to destroy all of it. And this is because they want the plague to kill the Warmbloods, because like the ants like hate everybody pretty much. I think they have like decently good reason to. I think like Suzanne Collins doesn't really bring them up again because honestly they're just like way too formidable of an enemy. They're brought up a couple times in terms of like it's difficult for the rats when they get like pushed out of their land, because then they're pushed away into the ants' territory, so that's part of this like conflict. But anyways, the ants show up to destroy all of the Starshade because they don't want anybody to cure the plague. So a really vicious battle, and Hamnet dies and all of the Starshade is destroyed. So that is pretty rough. So they're all like, shit, let's revisit the prophecy. Since the prophecy is a little weird, they never figured out what that like weird repeating verse meant, and they kind of knew that it could have a twist between the repeating verse and also the aspect of it being written backwards. And they're like, okay, well, what if this isn't the cradle of the disease? What if this is actually the cure? Where could the plague have come from? Gregor figures out that Ares probably didn't get it from the mites. Remember, there was like that whole like me being kind of snarky at the beginning, like, oh, good thing like Gregor didn't catch it, because again, the plague's like super contagious. They said that Ares got it like on the last quest, but nobody else on the last, or like Gregor didn't get it on the last quest. Howard and Andromeda, who were on the last quest, did get it, but Gregor kind of like has like a psych moment, has like a Sean Spencer moment, and he puts together some minor details and figures out that it probably came from Dr. Naviv's lab. So they're like, okay, well, does the prophecy support this? I mean, if that is the cradle, then the cure would be back home. And then there's also the fact that it's written reflected, and like when you have to look in the mirror to look at the prophecy to read it, you see yourself, so the humans see the humans, meaning the cure, like the humans made the plague and they have the cure. And then we have that phrase, turn and turn and turn again, you see the what but not the when, remedy and wrong entwined to form a single vine or whatever, pretty much saying that like the person who has the cure is what has is like where the disease came from. And also at this point in the valley, if you turn and turn and turn again, that means that you're facing Regalia. So they're like, Luxa is like, no, there is no way, like I just don't believe it. I don't believe that humans would have done it. It must be something else. The humans wouldn't make a bioweapon plague. They wouldn't do that. But she promises Ripred that if this is true, if the humans did do it, then she will send the cure to the rats immediately. And so Gregor kind of takes a minute and is like reflecting on all of this on the way back. Think we're right about the humans starting it? Asked Gregor. This is him talking to Nike the Bat. As Ripred says, I must hope we are, but Gregor, when the rest of the Warmbloods learn the plague was the humans' fault, it will be very ill indeed, said Nike. What will they say? Said Gregor. Most humans and their allies will be ashamed. Their enemies will say it only confirms what they suspected all along, that humans lie and will do anything to get what they want, said Nike. The awful thing is, no one will truly be surprised. Although he hadn't been born in the Underland, Gregor felt a natural kinship to the humans down here. He was still mad at them for putting him and Ares on trial when they hadn't killed the Bane, but he had chalked that up to being a misunderstanding. When Nerissa had explained the truth, the humans, at least the majority of them, had listened. Gregor's view of the rats was very different. He had always thought of them as essentially the bad guys, with a few exceptions like Twitch Trip and maybe Rip Red. The idea that the humans could be as bad as the rats, or even worse, threw him for a loop. But was he truly surprised? He remembered the council's attempt to deny the rats the flea powder. No, he couldn't say he was. So, kind of have a very straightforward distilling of how Gregor's feeling in the moment, and we'll talk about that at the end. So they head back to Regalia, but before they leave the jungle, I don't think I mentioned this, but when she escaped the labyrinth at the end of book 2, her and Aurora came to the jungle, and they had been hiding out here because Aurora's wing was injured, so she couldn't fly home. But they had been living with the nibblers, or the mice. The nibblers were in the jungle because they had been pushed there by the rats, in part because the rats had been forced to find different land because the humans blocked their access to that key river. But so she, if it weren't for the nibblers in the jungle, she wouldn't have lived. So before they head back to Regalia, Luxa thanks the nibblers and gives them her crown, saying that if they bring it to Regalia or bring it to a Regalian scout, then they will have their help, no questions asked. So they do that. They come back, and oh my god, would you guys believe the luck? Dr. Naviv just suddenly has a cure. So they do learn the truth. Dr. Naviv made the plague at Solivet's request, and she sent them to the Starshade Valley because even though she knew she made the plague, she knew it was her fault, she had to keep the plague secret because it's a super secret, top secret, government project or whatever. She also had tons and tons and tons of doses of the cure hidden in the caves. So she already had the cure. She had given it to herself. That's why she didn't get sick from her patients literally having it. So they distribute these cures, and Luxa makes good on her promise and sends a lot of these to the rats. Naviv is immediately executed, and it's not funny, but the way it happens in the book is they get back, they confront this. Gregor, everybody's obviously really tired from the quest, so they go to bed, and then the next morning Gregor's I want to talk to Naviv, and they're she's dead, she was executed, and it's okay, dang, that was really quick. But Solivet is jailed because, she's such a high-ranking military official. She literally is the head of the military, so they're not just gonna execute her immediately. And Vicus had no idea that any of this was happening. So again, it's they're such an interesting couple. Because, we never see that Solivet loves Vicus, but Vicus very much loves Solivet. I'm sure Solivet loves Vicus in her own way. But, you have this guy who's, dedicated to diplomacy, literally married to, a military strategist who was planning a bioweapon, plague. So, interesting. But yeah, he had no idea any of this was happening. He's heartbroken. Gregor goes and talks to Nerissa because he's well, if the cure was here, I don't understand the prophecy. Why do we have to go on this quest if it was here the whole time? And she explains that the quest allowed for some diplomacy, basically stopping a war. If they hadn't gone on the quest, then Luxa, there wouldn't never been the agreement to share the cure with the rats. The rats would have never gotten the anti-flea powder, and it would have gone differently. It wouldn't have been as good. So that helped him to avoid the war for now, she says. So Gregor and Boots head back up home, but his mom, who had the plague, she still has to stay down there to recuperate. And at the very end, Gregor tells Mrs. Cormacci everything. In the other couple books, it had been he didn't want to tell her. He was keeping the secret from her. His family knows about the Underland. Obviously, his dad was down here the whole time. But finally, he tells her everything. So from this point on, in terms of his home life, she's able to help them a bit more. But yeah, so let's talk about the politics and that stuff for this book, because this book is really the turning point in the series. It's the first book where it's really just okay, mask off, the humans are really bad, and you understand that is part of the story we're telling here. And they're responsible for a lot of the death and the cruelty. They are the bad guys in this book. I know it was the rats for the last 2 books, but they are the bad guys in this book. You obviously have the present situation where they literally created a plague that they meant to use on the rats. That was the intended target. They probably would have also just let the nibblers die. They probably would have let the rats and the nibblers die. They do have slightly good relations with the nibblers, so I think they maybe would have not let some of them die, but they definitely would not have gone out of their way to save ones in further colonies, the jungle or whatever. And if that plan if that plan got carried to fruition, they would have let everybody, they would have really only inoculated the humans and the bats. So, like, that is genocide. Granted, they don't say that Solivet had immediate plans for it, but, like, you don't develop a bioweapon and you don't develop the cure for the bioweapon if you're not planning on using it, or if you're not committed to using it if you feel like you need to. So, also, Medusa with mycelium reference, kind of little moment here. But anyways, that's already bad enough. We already have, like, bad stuff from the present day. And then you have Hamnet's story, where the Regalians and the humans, like, are just greedy and bloodthirsty, and they just one day decided that they didn't want peace with the rats and that they wanted everything for themselves. And they killed, like, I mean, they killed a bunch of rats. They killed a ton of their pups. And it's like, it's really bloodthirsty. It's terrible. And it's really sad, and we'll see that carry through. Granted, I said the rats are not the villains in this book. Of course, like, they do talk about in this book how they drove the mice out, how they want them all dead. We will 100% be picking that thread up in the next book. But, like, in the context of this book at least, that decision is framed as still mostly the humans' fault, because the whole reason why they pushed the mice out of their land is because the humans pushed them out of theirs and they had nowhere else to go. Again, you can start to see some things of, like, textbook historical themes of colonialism and oppression coming up. So that doesn't make the rats, like, right for doing that to the mice, obviously, but this, in the context of this book, this will change in the next book, but in the context of this book, it is because the humans blocked their land and starved them first. So pretty evil. And again, we saw, like, I read that passage where Gregor's kind of, like, realizing, like, he can no longer say, like, oh, it's just a misunderstanding, it's just a miscommunication. Like, the humans are really cruel. Like, the humans that our characters, like Gregor obviously, but, like, Luxa and Howard, even Meredith to an extent, they're more good. They're, like, not cruel and evil, they're the standouts. But this is, like, really where the veil becomes lifted, and where Gregor and kind of the, you know, a younger audience starts to see that, like, starts to get that message of, like, your side is not always the hero. And even when, like, you're fighting for what you believe in, you still have the moral responsibility of evaluating what your side is doing, and looking at, like, the ethics of that and deciding how you want to act within those situations. So Hamnet obviously, like, left completely. Gregor, we'll see what happens in the next books with how he acts. But yeah, plot-wise, this whole plague tension doesn't really do anything to ease or worsen the tensions between the rats and the humans. Like, it does worsen a little bit because they don't trust them, but they already didn't trust them. Like everybody mentioned, like, nobody is surprised that the humans did this. That is a big takeaway from the conversation Gregor had with Nike. But, like, you know, they did like send out the cures thanks to Luxa, so, like, everything's still kind of at a very tense piece. So, like, it does worsen trust a little bit with other species, but not that much, because they already expected it. They're already acting under the assumption that the humans would do something like this. So with that, let's turn to book 4, Gregor and the Marks of Secret. So at this point, I'll have to call back what I said at the start of the video and just note that from this point on, the plot will have some really dark and upsetting political actions and pretty explicit acts of, like, ethnic cleansing and genocide. So if that is not for you, click off the video. I mean, again, these are young adult books, but, you know, that is what's being mentioned. So the book starts, it's July back in the Overland, and since his last quest, Gregor has actually been going down to the Underland pretty often to check on his mom and also to have echolocation lessons with Rip Red. And he brings Rip Red down some little treats from his sister Lizzie when he goes. Lizzie, we haven't mentioned her a lot. The main sister we've talked about is Boots, but Lizzie is too scared to come down to see the Underland and to visit their mom. She gets, like, panic attacks, so she doesn't go down there, but she sends down, like, food and stuff for Rip Red. So Gregor heads down there one day to kind of do all that, and he meets up with Rip Red, and Rip Red has the Bane with him. So the Bane is, like, massive and really unstable. He has this, like, obsession with his tail, and also, like, he is, like, bursts out into violence and then doesn't like remember doing it or isn't like totally like in full capacity. So it's like, it's a little scary. So Gregor is like, okay, he really is a mess. And Rip Red is like, he's a mess, but the rats will definitely follow him since he's the Bane, and we should really kill him. So Rip Red explains that there's a prophecy called the Prophecy of Time, and in this prophecy, Gregor kills the Bane. This is so funny to me because I don't know what people thought of this prophecy. Like, did they think Gregor was supposed to kill the Bane twice? Because there's already another prophecy of him killing the Bane. So like, I'm a little confused by that, but whatever. Gregor agrees to come and try to kill the Bane at his lessons tomorrow, and he tries to ask more about this prophecy of time, but nobody really wants to tell him about it. So the next day, or like later on, whatever, no, the next day, Gregor shows up, but Rip Red isn't there, and instead he finds a rat named Twirltongue, so one of the rats that was mentioned in the conversation yesterday with the Bane, and some other rats. And Twirltongue talks to Gregor for a bit, and he gets his guard down because she's super persuasive. But then they try to kill Gregor, and he just barely escapes. Like, they almost kill him because they destroy his light, and his echolocation skills are like still non-existent, but he makes it out and barely escapes. So Gregor keeps coming down in the next few weeks, and he's more and more concerned because he hasn't heard from Rip Red. He's just like disappeared. So on one of these visits, Hazard, who is now living in Regalia after his dad died, he's hosting a 7th birthday party, and Gregor is invited. So Gregor brings Boots, and there's like this children's song, and they dance. But let's just look at this random nursery rhyme written by Bartholomew of Sandwich for no reason. Dancing in the firelight, see the queen who conquers night. Gold flows from her, hot and bright. Father, mother, sister, brother, off they go. I do not know if we will see another. Catch the nibblers in a trap. Watch the nibblers spin and snap. Quiet while they take a nap. Father, mother, sister, brother, off they go. I do not know if we will see another. Now the guests are at our door. Greet them as we have before. Some will slice and some will pour. Father, mother, sister, brother, off they go. I do not know if we will see another. So it's totally just like a random song that they dance to at this birthday party. There's also a little bit of romance brewing while Gregor and Luxa dance. It's just kind of cute. Gregor's like, oh my gosh, wait, I kind of think she's pretty. And so it's just kind of a cute moment. So after this dance, or during it, kind of in the middle of it, a bat arrives carrying Luxa's crown, saying that a nibbler gave it to him at Queen's Head. Luxa does not tell Vicus or anyone what this means, because she knows that the council would never let her go and investigate what was wrong. Because remember, she promised like the nibblers like bring this crown and like I'll help you. So she also knows that they won't send the mice any help either because it takes the council way too long to decide to do anything. So Gregor and Luxa sneak off to Queen's Head to speak with this mouse. So when they get there, the mouse is dead. And before she died, she scratched a strange symbol into the ground. And they check the cave and the jungle where Luxa was during the last book, but all the nibblers are gone. So they're a little concerned. They return back to Regalia, and they soon discover that a basket of baby mice has come down on the river from the fount. So if we look at the map, these are in like 2 separate areas. So Hazard talks to the baby mice in Mouse, because he's been learning a lot more languages, and they say that their mom sent them, but they can't really explain more because they're really young. So at this point, Luxa is extremely concerned about the mice, as is Gregor, because this means that the jungle colony and the colony at the fount have been affected by whatever is going on. So the two decide to go investigate the colony by the fount since they already checked out the jungle. And they do this under the guise of going on a picnic so that they can bring a lot of food. But because of this, Howard, Nike, Hazard, Boots, and Temp, we love Temp, they also end up coming on this trip. Also, in order to try to like sneak away on their own, Gregor tries to say that this is like a date with Luxa. And so then on the way to, on like the journey there, Howard talks to Gregor about this. Gregor, as Luxa has no older brother, I feel I must speak for her, as I would speak for one of my little sisters. I know you use what you call a date with her as a cover, but in the future you must think of an alternative. Why, said Gregor, although he could guess. Because she's a queen, because you are an overlander, and because you are both too young, and because even if you were not, such a pairing could have no happy future, said Howard. The process of finding a spouse in the underland is a long and delicate one. A spouse? This is getting entirely out of hand. Howard, it wasn't a date in the first place, said Gregor. I understand, but for you to even mention it as a possibility shows how little you know of the underland. Remember, too, that you expected me to believe your lie, and ask yourself why you thought it would be a plausible one. That pulled Gregor up short. He could feel himself blushing as deeply as Luxa had. At the time, he guessed he had expected Howard to at least entertain the possibility that he and Luxa might like each other. And worse still, there had been that moment when Howard looked like he was buying it. Dates aren't a big deal in the Overland, Gregor said lamely. They would be for him. Well, they would be monumental here, said Howard, especially with my cousin. I'm going to be reading a lot more passages from these last two books because I think they're really important, but I'm also going to try to read some of the happier ones because these last two books are really upsetting. So I think it's kind of cute. He's like, okay, sorry. So they make it to the fount, where the colony is supposed to be, and they find nothing. And this is also especially strange because the fount is like an official colony for the Nibblers to live after I think the rats had displaced them. So it's kind of under the protection of some of the humans who live there. So the fount, if you remember, is where Howard and his family, so Luke's cousins on that side, where they live. So they have like sentries and like guards who are supposed to be kind of patrolling or keeping an eye on the colony, and they don't know what happened. I don't know. I think that's kind of weird. That's not like a clue or anything. I just think that's kind of weird. It doesn't really come back, but it's weird because it just looks like all the Nibblers just like poofed out of existence one day. Oh wait, they do mention the guards, ignore me. The only strange thing that they see is a similar mark to the one that they saw at Queen's Head, and Hazard recognizes it, and he starts freaking out because it's something called it's called a mark of secret, which is an old group of symbols that people supposedly don't really use anymore, and this one is the scythe, which brings death to those who see it. And Hazard's mother died after seeing it, so that's why he's super, super worried. This is where the guards come in. They figure that the only way the Nibblers could have gone out of the font without being seen by the guards is if they went through this diagonal chamber called the swag, which I'm like, if there's like another, actually this kind of, I don't know, why don't you have somebody guarding that then? If something has two entrances, why are you only at one of them? That seems kind of weird to me, but whatever. So they go in there, but an earthquake happens, blocking the way back. So now they're in the swag, but then they have to go through like Hades Hall, which it's kind of difficult. This is where the map stuff gets tricky because Lux explains it that like the underland is not just like a plane. Some tunnels go under it. So I think while they're under Hades Hall, maybe they're under the jungle. I don't know. They're under like other parts. They're just like under stuff. So it's kind of confusing with the map, but it's kind of like this whole other cave system below everything. But it ultimately will split them out in the Firelands. And Hades Hall is really like creepy, crawly. But while they're traveling through here, they come across our favorite fireflies, Zap and Photos Glow. And they say that the Shiners have been pushed down here by the Slimers, or like the snails, which is kind of funny because they're snails. They move like really slowly. Also, it's like, why does that affect you? Because you fly. So like, I don't know. I feel like those two species should be able to figure out how to share space, but whatever. So yeah, they're like pushed down here. Everybody's getting pushed out of everybody's land. Messed up. After some fighting about the outcome of them selling them out on the last quest they were on together, they decide to join them because they really do need the light, and they promise to like catch fish for them or something. I don't know. They do also say though that the Nibblers came through, and they were driven here. They were driven through Hades Hall by rats. So that's interesting. Not long after this, they come across a pit full of dead mice who had very clearly been driven off a cliff. They describe it. It's like really horrific, but they do find one mouse who is barely alive, and they save him, although he's like extremely, extremely traumatized and like not really making any sense and stuff. While at this mass grave, Gregor and Luxa, after they finish like checking if anybody else was alive, they add Gregor adds a makeshift gravestone with a scythe, since they can't really do anything else to bury them or anything like that. And Luxa says a few words. Upon this crown, my pledge I give, to my last breath I hold this choice. I will your unjust deaths avenge, all here who died without a voice. The words reverberated around the tunnel. It was not an impromptu rhyme, something she had made up off the top of her head. There was a specific ritual and a grim formal tone to the lines. Gregor was certain it was an oath, something you swore to fulfill or died trying to. It came from such an agonized place within Luxa that Gregor wanted to wrap his arms around her, but the oath had pushed him away from her too, had reminded him that he was just a visitor in a strange land where people vowed vengeance and crowns mattered and queens were off limits to him. So we come to learn that she just did this oath called the Vow of the Dead, and essentially Luxa had just declared war on the rats for doing this to the mice. So with this, like, all the like chattering and stuff was all the other species in Hades Hall hearing this, because this is like a big deal. So this basically, like, the humans back in Regalia, at this point they know like Luxa's gone, but this like species chatter makes its way back to Regalia. Because of that, like people in Regalia will eventually, like, it soon know that Luxa has declared war on the rats. So they make their way out of Hades Hall and into the Firelands, where they find a huge mass of rats and the Bane giving a speech. I know what we once were, the unquestioned rulers of the Underland, and I know what we have been of late. Weak, hungry, diseased, at the mercy of our enemies, tortured by humans and mocked by creatures who in the past would not have dared to look us in the eye. We've never been liked, but we were always feared, until Gorger died. When the others stopped fearing us, they stopped respecting us. Does it bother you when the crawlers laugh as they strip our rivers clean of fish? A few of the rats called out, yes. When the cutters claim land we have held for centuries? Yes. When the humans infect us with a germ that ravages our species and then try to smooth things over with a few baskets of grain? Yes. How many of you lost pups? And how many of you still call yourself parents? Which is worse, to watch them suffer and die quickly, or to see them die slowly, stripped of pride, groveling at the feet of inferior creatures? Is that the life we want for our children? No. The humans. We knew from the moment they arrived that the Underland was not big enough to hold us both, and we will deal with the humans in proper time. But there are others who must be taken care of first. If we ask ourselves who caused our troubles, we must ask ourselves who benefited by our suffering, who found fertile land to feed in, whose numbers increased while ours diminished, whose pups thrived while our own died of starvation and disease. The nibblers came from the crowd. Yes, the nibblers. My father used to joke that the only good nibbler he ever saw was a dead nibbler. Maybe if he had used his time acting instead of joking, we would not be here today. Tell me if you can, why not one nibbler pup died of the plague? Why, when gnawers and flyers and even humans writhed in agony, they alone remained well? I'll tell you why, because it was their plague. Everyone blames the humans, the fools even blame themselves. But where did that germ come from? It had to be from somewhere. The humans did not create it in their laboratories. We all know where the plague is born, in the jungle, and who, until quite recently, made the jungle their home. They found that germ, they gave it to the humans to turn into a weapon to be used against us. But not before they had the cure. All along they had the cure. All along they were safe and smug while they watched us die. We have tried to drive them from our lands again, but it is never far enough. I say this time we drive them to a place that allows no return. So he speaks a bit more of this. The stuff about the disease is obviously a lie. That's not true. The humans made the disease. This speech goes on for a little bit, but eventually some of the rats notice the humans, notice our crew, so they hide away in some tunnels and they almost fight scorpions, but then they resolve things peacefully because they talk. Do you understand? Do you understand the allegory here? While they rest here, they talk about the scorpion species politically, and Gregor learns what the other name for the humans is. So the gnars are the rats, the nibblers are the mice, flyers are the bats. Everything down here has two names. But he's never really thought about the name for humans, what the other name must be. And the humans are called killers. And Luxa is like, that's an old word, no one uses it anymore. And Hazard is like, actually, that is what most other species call you in their own language. I think that is really interesting. So after seeing the Bane and like getting chased in his tunnels, they continue to kind of make their way across the Firelands, hoping to find the mice themselves. So they keep doing this until they come across Rip Red. He was stuck in an obsidian pit where the Bane had trapped him, and he couldn't escape because obsidian is like super, super smooth. So it is a little funny though, because like they were not really that worried about finding him. Like Gregor thinks about him occasionally, is like worried about him, but like they don't even seem like too pressed about it, but whatever. So they get him out, and he explains that the Bane is not just driving the nibblers from all their colonies. He is planning on killing them all, but last Rip Red I'd heard the Bane did not have a way of doing this yet. But they soon find out how he plans to do this. So they see all the mice being driven to a pit by the base of a huge volcano in the Firelands. And in this pit, like, they're like, okay, well, the volcano is, like, it's gonna, like, the lava is gonna come and kill them. So the mice they do, like, this whole, like, pyramid thing to get out of the pit. But then that's when the real threat makes itself known, and that is a poisonous gas that is coming from the volcano that is heavy. So it comes out of the volcano and then sits in the pit. So Luxa starts, I mean, she like goes crazy once they realize that she's trying to save them, but they kind of have, the Rip Red has to like hold her back, because there's nothing they can do to save them. Because of the gas, it's too dangerous for them. Finally they listen to Temp. Temp is like, don't do it. So all the mice in the pit at that time die. So it's not all the mice, but it's a lot of them. So while they're processing this, Boots starts to sing the song from the beginning of the book, the dance, the totally random song I mentioned that you probably guessed is a prophecy. So they realize that this is a prophecy. They realize that the queen is the volcano. They realize that this last part where it says, now the guests are at our door, greet them as we have before. They realize that that is about Regalia being invaded. So Luxa and Rip Red, they plan to gather the remaining nibblers, any mice that have survived, so that they can help fight the rats and free the other mice. And they want Gregor to go back to Regalia to warn them about the attack, but also because they need Gregor to get Bartholomew Sandwich's sword, because that is what he's prophesied to kill the Bane with in the Prophecy of Time. Again, he still doesn't know what it says in the Prophecy of Time. So at this point, the volcano erupts, and this kills Talia, who is basically Hazard's bond. It's really sad. She's still like a kid. She's like a young bat, so it's really sad. After this, they split up to do their respective tasks. Gregor shares a sweet moment with Luxa before he leaves, and then he heads back to Regalia with Hazard and Boots in order to prepare for the events in book 5. Let's talk about this book. This book and the last book are super closely connected. Like, the last book is going to pick up exactly where this one starts. It's very much a kind of like a part 1 and part 2 of events, more than it is like a book 4 and book 5. Like, each book up to this point has been pretty separately delineated. But obviously this one is also really, really dark. I mean, I had to do like kind of a trigger warning before it. It's really dark and it's really upsetting. And you can kind of see now what I meant about, like, it has its roots in very real political conflicts that people live through or people don't live through. And they take the themes that were starting to be introduced in the previous book and they really ramp them up. The main theme being that violence begets violence. I mean, the Bane very clearly spells out that their motivation for all of this is because of what the humans did. Obviously, that's not to say this is like the humans' fault, but we can see how this makes a very persuasive argument to people who are in difficult times, like being starved and like being subjected to plague. If you know anything about history, like that is arguments that's what pushes people to fall into very evil and cruel actions like this. Yeah, you know, people are very susceptible to leaders who blame other groups and racism or speciesism in this book and whatnot, and who want to use that blame game to gain power in their own right. So obviously I'm distilling these themes a lot, especially since, like, you know, I mean, this is a kid's book, so they do make it fairly straightforward and digestible as much as it can be for like 11 to 12-year-olds, but we can see how this book does introduce a lot of like nuance, and yeah, just like nuance into war stories. It's not, this is coming off the back of book 3 where the humans are the bad guys. Obviously in this book, the rats are the bad guys, but it doesn't switch around to mean that the humans are the good guys. We just have 2 bad guys now, and you know, one that is obviously a much more pressing threat to deal with. Yeah, well, I'm gonna pick up more on that in book 5. This book is just like, it's just very interesting. In terms of the other politics, we also do learn a bit more on the backstory of why all the other species hate the humans. And we also see a lot of species who see what the rats are doing and they don't do anything about it. This being the scorpions, the shiners, and I think like the snails, like a couple of other insects like know what's happening. They don't really do anything. This does help to make the humans seem more, you know, good and ethical compared to these other species. But also, like, in this book, the only good humans are like our characters, like Luxa and Howard and Gregor, obviously. So we'll see this in the next book too. Like, well, no, I mean, we see in this book, Luxa, the whole reason why the humans are going to get involved is, I mean, number one, they don't really need a reason to want to fight the rats. But the only reason why they care about the nibblers is because Luxa is strong-arming them. She made that oath, so she kind of already forced them into it, and she's their queen. She's getting herself into a war, and her army has to come and get her and back her up. So if she weren't doing that, it's definitely up in the air as to if they would have cared about this, because honestly, I don't know if they would have. I don't know if they would have thought it was worth it. So there's really not much else to say on this one until we see kind of the resolution of the whole story in book 5. Okay, let's get into Gregor and the Code of Claw. This is the longest book out of the series. So let's get started. This book starts off really quickly. Like I mentioned, it's right after the events of the last book. Everybody kept mentioning the prophecy of time, but nobody would show Gregor the prophecy of time. And in the first few pages of this book, he learns why that is. So let's read this prophecy. The war has been declared, your ally been ensnared. It's now or it is never. Break the code or die forever. Time is running out, running out, running out. To the warrior give my blade. By his hand your fate is made. But do not forget the ticking or the clicking, clicking, clicking. While a rat's tongue may be flicking, with its feet it does the tricking. For the paw, and not the jaw, makes the coat of claw. Time is standing still, standing still, standing still. Since the princess is the key to unlock the treachery, she cannot avoid the matching or the scratching, scratching, scratching. When a secret plot is hatching, in the naming is the catching. What she saw, it is the flaw of the coat of claw. Time is turning back, turning back, turning back. When the monster's blood is spilled, when the warrior has been killed, you must not ignore the rapping or the tapping, tapping, tapping. If the gnawers find you napping, you will rot while they are mapping out the law of those who gnaw in the coat of claw. Obviously, the line that nobody wanted him to read was when the warrior has been killed. So Gregor is obviously upset and disturbed by this, but as we've seen, like with when he thought Boots had died, he does not let himself process this because he can't. Like, he is in the middle of a war now. He has a job to do. He just kind of feels numb right now. So he kind of encourages that as a coping mechanism since he has to kill the Bane. He has decided he's going to kill the Bane. He's not going to try to take Boots and run or anything like that. But he tries to head back to the battlefield basically like immediately after he gets to Regalia, warns them, and has like a bit of rest. But Marith stops him and is like, you can't go. This is war now, and you're a soldier. And just because you're the warrior does not mean that you're kind of exempt from that, and you have to follow Solivet's orders. Solivet's, said Gregor, genuinely thrown. As far as he knew, she was no longer in a position to give anyone's orders. I thought she was locked up in her room and had to go on trial for causing the plague. The trial was put on hold once it was known that Luxa had declared war, said Marith. But why? That doesn't change what Solivet did. She still ordered the doctors to make the plague into a weapon. She still killed all those people in bats. She almost killed my mom. By accident. Her plan was to kill the rats, said Marith. Now that we're at war with them, a person who thinks of little but killing rats is of great value. So the council has reinstated her as the head of the Regalian army. No way. Couldn't have got someone else? There is no human, save yourself, who the rats fear as much. Solivet is both cunning and ruthless in war. It was felt we needed her to survive. But the trial will never happen now, said Gregor bitterly. It wouldn't. The war would erupt and blank everything else out. As the hatred against the rats built, the humans would think Solivet had a good idea in turning the plague germs into a weapon. Despite all the deaths she had caused to her own people, she would be seen as heroic, not criminal. Gregor thought of his mom struggling to breathe somewhere in the hospital, the purple scars that Ares first still could not quite cover. All of the people and bats who had died. That's not right, Marith, said Gregor. Do you think it's right? Marith sighed and averted his eyes. Whatever my private opinion of the situation, it is of no matter. Solivet is now in command. Not of me, said Gregor. Be careful to whom you say that, Gregor. Not everyone here is your friend. So, we are on like the first couple pages of this book, and Marith's right. Like, Gregor needs to be more careful. I said this at the beginning. Gregor, like, offends people. He doesn't really have that much of a filter, but he is realizing he needs to fix that, like, now, because it's wartime. And as Marith said, just because he's the warrior does not mean that he is like super, super special or like above these things. They tried to try him for treason, you know? This part, it's so key because it just, again, very effectively like reminds him of that. It like reminds him that Gregor is a separate entity from Regalia, and like he needs to keep that in mind. It's funny how quickly it devolved from him being like the prophetical savior in book 1 to being a very, very, very implicit tool. Really, there's no more veneer on it anymore. I mean, that's what Solivet always had in mind for him, and we kind of saw that with the story about Hamnet. Hamnet even had a line to Gregor like, "Oh, I can see how quickly my mom's gotten her claws into you," or something like that. So, I mean, it's sad, and Gregor is like, he really just sees the situation he's in. And even though Merrick's right that not everybody is his friend, also not everybody is his enemy. Not everybody is a fan of Solivet or a fan of this war and what's happening. When Gregor's seeing his mom, a doctor tells him, like, listen, she's being treated down here, but if I were you and this was my mother in this war, I would find a way to get her back to Overland stat. But he says, like, don't tell anybody I said that. But Solivet, she's not having that. So she needs to keep Gregor down here, and because again, like he has boots. He technically could just leave at any given point and leave them to deal with this mess. So Solivet, she views his mom as insurance, so she's not gonna let him leave. She's not gonna let Gregor leave. She's not gonna let his mom leave either. So she even assigns bodyguards to Gregor to make sure he stays in Regalia. All this does, though, is make Gregor even more desperate to defy Solivet. So him and Ares, they find a way to sneak out, and they head back to the battlefield in the Firelands. They immediately jump in, they start fighting against the rats. He sees Ripred and some other, folks on their side leading some of the mice into a tunnel. They lead them through this tunnel with the rats right on their heels, and once they cross some water, they light oil that had been placed in the tunnel, and they kill a ton of rats. And this is a cruel but effective plan that Luxa devised. And while her plan was good, Luxa is not good, because she has been on the battlefield for a while now, breathing in the ash from the volcano that erupted at the end of the last book. And she's really sick. So Gregor rushes her and a couple of mouse pups, or actually a ton of mouse pups with some other people. They rush them back to Regalia. Solivet is obviously not pleased with Gregor's excursion, and she has him locked up in a dungeon because Gregor, he didn't listen to Meredith. I mean, he's still like 11 or 12 or whatever at this point, so he gets locked up, and she doesn't tell anybody. She literally just locks him up. This time in the old slammer helps Gregor a bit. And then something happened that changed his entire perception of the world. Gregor coughed. It was just a small cough, but in the instant it left his mouth, it was as if lightning had struck the room. He could see. Okay, not exactly, but it was still dark in his cell, but he could tell with absolute certainty the proximity of the wall across from him. It was almost as if a picture of it appeared in his head. Shocked out of his despair, Gregor sat up and coughed again. There was his tray, the plate, and the mug. Somewhere in his brain he could register their shapes on the floor as if in silhouette. But there was more. The mug gave off a faint redness that suggested heat. Why? He scooted over to the mug and wrapped his fingers around it. It was still warm from his pee. So, he's learned echolocation. The heat thing is funny because I don't think that that's how that would work. But this passage changed me as a child, because I was like, are you telling me I could learn echolocation? And I literally like locked myself in a dark closet and was just like clicking and like coughing and making all sorts of noise. I can't echolocate. I mean, I think I like read about it a bunch when I was like a kid, and I think some people, like, when they lose their sight, maybe can do something like this. I mean, definitely not what's happening in this book. So obviously, I mean, I couldn't do that, but I do think that, because I literally tried this for like weeks, and I think that doing that did help me with like my sense of how I interpret sound. I don't know. Maybe that's like really embarrassing to say, but I was like, I gotta have what he's having. Back to the book. So Gregor, thankfully, is only in this cell for a few days before Nerissa, again, she can like see shit, so she finds him and she takes him from there to the code room. Also, I don't think I mentioned this, but when Luxa was revealed to be alive, she is queen again, not Nerissa. But anyways, she finds him and she takes him from the dungeon to the code room because they have need of him there. Remember, the prophecy basically is like saying that they need to break the rats code. I mean, this is all like very World War II coded. The prophecy is basically saying that like they need to break the rats code in order to like end the war, that if they don't break the code, that like bad things are gonna happen, and they need the princess or Boots to solve that. So they take him to the code room. Solvet wants to lock him up again, but she doesn't, because Marith and Rip Red reveal that he is in love with Luxa. And they prove this by the fact that he has like a Polaroid of her that they took together at Hazard's party. And so if she's there, then he won't flee the Underland. And he's super embarrassed about this, but it works. Solvet doesn't lock him up. And it's kind of cute. But anyways, he heads to the code room. The code room is basically this like massive like circular like room with different chambers where representatives from each species are supposed to be there to help break a code. So they have somebody from each of the species, and the code stuff is really, really interesting. I'm not going to go too much into it, but all the creatures at one point use this like tree of transmission. It's pretty much like Morse code, and they used it so that they could communicate cross species when like they couldn't hear like different pitches or stuff like that. Nobody really uses that anymore, but the Code of Claw uses that, but it's like an encrypted version of it, and so they can't crack that. And they're hoping that Gregor can help like tame Boots, because again, she's still a toddler, that they can like tame her into solving the code, because she's prophesied to solve it. She is obviously no hope because she can't read. She is literally a toddler. But then Lizzie, his other sister, arrives in the Underland, and she came because their dad is sick and their grandma is in the hospital. But then Rip Red is like, wait, this is your sister who does math and puzzles and stuff to calm herself down when she's having anxiety attacks. And what do you call the sister of a princess? A princess. They start to work on the code. Gregor's like not happy about this. He doesn't want Lizzie to stay. He doesn't really have a choice because, I mean, she fell down here. It's lucky that that the rats didn't get her. I mean, this is wartime, so it's like even harder to get in and out. There's basically like no chance for her to get out again. Rip Red talks to him a bit more, and basically like he promises Gregor that so Gregor didn't tell anybody, like his sisters, that he's supposed to die in the prophecy, understandably. And Rip Red promises him that after he's dead, he will, like, Rip Red is like, I promise you, I will get your mom and your sisters out of here. So that makes Gregor feel a bit better, but obviously not happy. Because also, yeah, Lizzie came down here because the dad is sick and the grandma's in the hospital. So, I mean, it's just not good. I mean, Mrs. Cormacci is helping, but I mean, it's just rough. I think Vicus is able to like send up some money or something to them. I don't know. Solivet takes Gregor and Ares into battle briefly to see how they fight, but they kind of suck, and so she's like, no, you gotta train more. Gregor is really offended by this, but he does learn a lot from the training, and after the training he gets to check in on Luxa and how she's healing from the gas poisoning. She's mending, but Gregor keeps thinking about how he's going to die, and that just really impacts him. Luxa is like asking about why they let him out of the dungeon, like why they trusted him to not run away. How could he face an army of rats and not have the courage to say something so simple and so obvious? Suddenly he felt his hand reaching into his pocket and pulling out the photo of them dancing, the one that had convinced Solivet he was crazy about Luxa. He placed it on her tray. This is the reason I don't have bodyguards, he said, and promptly headed for the door, too afraid to see her reaction. But as he rounded the corner, he saw her smile. It's so cute. It's so cute. Again, I have to keep reading like the cute parts because this book's so sad. Gregor, he trains, learns a lot about training, and even though Gregor is being hit like a good little warrior on his best warrior behavior for Solivet, it's not enough for her. It's not enough insurance. So she has his mom moved to the Fount as like triple insurance that he won't break her out, and also just kind of as a show of her power, I think, like, you will listen to me and I am in charge of you. Gregor is so pissed off about this that he's like, I'm gonna head back into the battlefield and I'm going to make her listen to me and bring my mom back. So on his way out of Regalia, he's like walking through some like farmlands. So on his way out of Regalia, he's confronted with something strange, and that is basically a giant mole, or a digger. A giant mole breaks through the ground and doesn't kill him at first because doesn't know, he smells different because he's an overlander, he smells different. He thinks that they have nothing to do with the war, and he tries to tell him like, get out, like he's like, if Solivet sees you here, like she's gonna kill you because you've like dug under the defenses. And once he mentions the humans and the moles realize that he's on their side, the mole tries to kill him, and so he kills that mole. But after this happens, he talks to Vicus, and he learns that these are the diggers or the moles, and that they are allied with the Bane. Those 4 in the field cannot be the entire population. Others are out there, and they've allied themselves with the Bane. Why? Asked Gregor. This land, the land upon which Regalia is built, belonged to them many years ago, said Vicus wearily. When Sandwich arrived, he wanted it. The diggers would not leave, so he began a war. He won, said Gregor. Even in his foggy state, he could feel the injustice of it all. It was a nice chunk of real estate, a Regalia. Rivers, springs, relatively easy to defend. How long had it been the diggers' home before Sandwich had descended from the overland and laid claim to it? He won. First there was battle, and when that threatened to fail, he poisoned the diggers' water supply. This was not a tactic they had any knowledge of. Only a few were thought to have escaped, none to have survived. Killers. That was the name Hazard had said for the other creatures in the underland used for the humans, but not to their faces. That's why. Yes, that is why we are known as killers, Vicus said. Why so many still hate and fear us, why the diggers still want us dead. Didn't attack me, Gregor said. Not at first. Not until he'd said they were on humans' land. They must have realized you're not one of us. At least they gave you the benefit of the doubt. Gregor closed his eyes and let the information swim around him. So Sandwich, the founder of Regalia, the eerily accurate visionary who had created this new world far below the surface of the earth, was first and foremost a butcher. And yet they all still struggled to understand those fancy words he had carved in the prophecy room, how they lived and died by them. The prophecies were held in such reverence that Gregor had never even thought to question whether their author had been a good or bad person. But now he knew. He'd been risking everything under the direction of a man who had set out to slaughter an entire species to get his hands on a good piece of property. And Gregor carried his sword. Not good, Gregor said. It is horrendous. It is a shame that we have never lived down, said Vicus. What now? Now we pay for it is only a matter of time before the remaining diggers will tunnel into the palace, and then the Bane will follow. The humans were invaders who had not even wanted a fair fight. To make matters worse, the moles hadn't attacked Gregor at first. They had given him a chance to at least say where he stood, and he had stood with the humans. It was a terrible feeling to be on the wrong side of what was right. Not with the rats. He still felt that after what he had witnessed in the Firelands, he was right to try to protect the mice. But with the moles, of course, who knew what stories the rat might be able to produce to justify their own vicious behavior? The rats and the humans had been fighting for so long, the list of atrocities on both sides was appalling, and Gregor had felt above that somehow until he had killed the moles. I mean, this is it's so sad. This is obviously such a big deal for Gregor. I mean, it's obviously a huge deal to learn. Like he said, he never questioned, the prophecies that everybody told him to follow. Again, we can see some really, really, really obvious parallels. And I say they're obvious. Obviously, they weren't obvious to me when I was reading this as, 12-year-old. I wasn't thinking about that. But reading all this now, I mean, I'm certain that this affected how I interpreted things later down the line when I learned about historical facts and stuff like that. But this is obviously a really big deal for him, and I think it's one of the best points of clarity about his feelings about being wrapped up in this. And I mean, he feels sickened by it, and of course he's 11 or maybe he's 12 at this point, but he's not equipped to deal with this, and he knows that the rats are wrong, that he should be protecting the mice, but that doesn't mean that he is right with where he's standing. And so it's just very complicated, and just these books are just so just so good. Gregor goes to sleep for a bit after hearing all this to kind of recoup in the code room, and in the middle of the night he just hears something else extremely upsetting, which is a conversation between Rip Red and Lizzie. And again, sorry I'm reading so much from this one, but I mean, as you can see, I feel like the writing's so good in the whole series, but it's just how am I supposed to sum this up in a way that is better than what's written here for some of these parts? What Gregor overhears is Rip Red trying to calm Lizzie down after another one of her panic attacks in the middle of the night. How did she die? The one who is like me, Lizzie asked. What was she talking about? How did who die? When had Rip Red known someone like Lizzie before? Silk Sharp, at the Garden of Hesperides, said Rip Red. I know about that. Gregor told me. The dike broke and there was a big flood. So she drowned? Asked Lizzie. I tried to get there. Rip Red shook his head. Too late. And your wife and the other pups? Asked Lizzie. Lost them all. All gone. No chance to even say goodbye. There was a long pause, and then the rat continued. I went off alone for months. I wanted to die. I tried to, but it takes a lot to kill me. So you came back, said Lizzie. I couldn't stand it. The thought that they had died and nothing was to come of it. And that's when I decided it all had to change. I mean, like, it's so sad. Like, it's so sad. And like, that's why that's why I love Rip Red. Like, he's one of the best written characters. I mean, his motivations up until this point are always up in the air, and you don't really understand why he's like doing all this. You just kind of from this really understand that he wants to fight for a better world, and then also like that's why it's kind of mentioned at several points he has a sweet spot for Lizzie, and like learning that it's because she reminds him of his dead daughter is like so sad. Like, it's so sad because like she's been dead for like over a decade at this point. Like, all this happened like 10 years ago. And as sad as this book is, it does have some kind of bright moments, and those are the ones I keep sticking to because this book needs them. But before heading out to meet Rip Red and prepare for the next stage of what's to come, Gregor takes Luxa to the museum to have some time alone, and they kiss, and it is really sweet. And I think they're so cute. I think part of why I love like young adult books or like kids books is just because like the little romances in them, I mean, they're just really sweet, and like they're just cute. It's always like the kind of like first crush kind of thing. It's just very sweet and cute. And in this book specifically, when you're rereading this as like, you know, when I'm reading this as like somebody in my mid-20s, like seeing the ethical things that he's going through and like the horrors that he's being placed in, that he's seeing, and then seeing that juxtaposed with like him realizing for the first time that he thinks a girl is pretty, it definitely, I mean, it adds like some levity to the book in terms of like, oh my god, that's really cute, that's really sweet, but also you're like, oh my god, I forgot this kid is literally 11 and this is the first time he's ever been like, wait, I think a girl is pretty. Time is cut short because the rats, as prophesized, have arrived in Regalia, and we get the meaning of the last stanza from book 4's prophecy: some will slice and some will pour. Now, so the prophecy is, now the guests are at our door, greet them as we have before, some will slice and some will pour. The rats were already being sliced open with swords, and so as Ares said, it must be time to pour. The cauldrons must have been ready to go at a moment's notice. They were made of thick black iron and had arched metal handles like baskets. Bats flew them up onto the wall, and teams of humans wearing protective gloves and goggles tipped them forward, releasing gallons of boiling oil onto the rats below. Horrible shrieks filled the air, and the entire enemy line fell back, leaving a half-dozen scalded rats writhing at the base of the wall. Shall we torch them? A soldier asked Olivet. Just 2, I think. I do not want the smoke to interfere with our sight lines. Burning torches were immediately dropped on the 2 least fortunate rats, and they became fireballs. They ran in frantic circles then, and rolled to put the flames out, but it was useless. Their coats were already soaked in oil. The smell of burnt fur, then burnt flesh, filled the air. Then the rats fell unconscious, probably from shock, but their bodies still lay burning at the foot of the wall. It was one of the worst things Gregor had witnessed in the Underland. I mean, it's brutal. It's just, this book is just brutal. The Bane is among the rat army at Regalia's doors, and Gregor goes out to kill him. He's not able to though, but he does cut off his tail, and if you remember, the Bane has this really weird attachment with his tail, so this makes him go literally insane, and so then he screams at all the bats to storm Regalia. Gregor is really badly wounded from this fight though. He can barely move, and basically has to hide for literally hours. Like, they think he's dead, but then Howard finds him, and he's able to like reset his dislocated ribs, which is what disables him. My ribs dislocate all the time, and I'll tell you, it is very disabling. That's why I'm disabled. He's decently okay. So he goes to the code room. So the rats, they've stormed the city of Regalia, but everybody is holed up in the palace now, and they haven't broken in there yet. After having his ribs reset, he goes to the code room, and Lizzie actually manages to break the code. I'm not gonna go into this earlier. I didn't even mention this earlier, but basically, like, it says something like, in the naming is the catching. What she saw is the flaw in the code of Claw, and that is the similarity between the name Gregor and the name Gorger, like King Gorger. That was something that like Lizzie said at like the end of book 1 or something. I didn't even mention it, so sorry. But the code is, it has to do with that. I like not getting into the code at all. It's fun, but it's whatever. So they translate some of the code that they have, and they learn that Twitch Tip, the beloved rat, the scent seer, all the way from, what was that, book 2? Yeah, that she just died recently. So last we had heard about her is that she was badly injured. She was able to help Gregor get close to the Bane, and then she was actually able to help Luxa and Boots escape. She was then imprisoned. She was then imprisoned in a pit and likely tortured, and she just now died recently. So this whole time she had been kept in a pit, imprisoned, and likely tortured. And this is what finally breaks Gregor. He just breaks down and starts crying. And I think that's, I don't know, I think it's really interesting, and it's just really, really sad, you know. It's just like the final straw for him. And he is like kind of baffled at himself for this. Like, after all this time, he hasn't cried since learning that he's gonna die, and this is what does it for him. But yeah, so they translate that. They keep translating the code, but they have to keep it totally secret. The rats can't know that they've broken the code. So soon after this, they translate more code, and they learn that the moles have broken through the palace defenses and are pretty much like right about to break into the palace with the rats. So Ripred makes Gregor hole up in the prophecy room with Boots and Nerissa, and while there, they read another prophecy that Nerissa says comforts her. On soft feet by none detected, dealing death by most rejected, killed by claw, since resurrected, marked by X, 2 lines connected. Finally, they intersected, 2 lines met, 1 unexpected. We'll come back to that later, obviously. I'm not reading a prophecy for no reason. But anyways, after days of being holed up, the rats are finally pushed out of the palace, so they did break through. Yeah, they're pushed out of the palace, and Ripred gets Gregor because they need to pursue them. I think this is like really, I don't know, I'm like kind of confused, like battle-wise, what's happening here. Like, how do you like push somebody back and then now you're pursuing them? But whatever, that's what's happening. Gregor, him and Ripred get ready to pursue them. Solivet does not want, she forbids Luxa to come because she's queen, she can't be on the battlefield, and Gregor knows that Luxa is going to sneak out. And in order to protect her, he actually betrays her. He tells Solivet to put her in the dungeon. And Gregor is upset that he betrayed her, but he knows that it was the right call. And he heads to the plain of Tartarus because that's where they're set to intercept the rats. So as they head there, Solivet heads to the spinners, the spiders, to try to make an ally out of them. Soon after she leaves, though, they receive a translated code stating that the rats know that she's going and that they're going to ambush Solivet on the trip and kill her. But they can't go try and save her because if they do, that would reveal that they broke the code, and they can't have that. So Solivet dies. Womp womp. Rest in hell, girl. They learn this. Gregor tried to think of something consoling to say to Vicus, but he was never good at this stuff. It was even more difficult because while he knew Vicus must have loved Solivet, he also knew they had fought a lot. Their ideas on how to handle problems were totally different. When he discovered his wife's role in the plague, Vicus had been crushed, but he must have loved her because he was utterly stricken now. Hazard came over and kneeled next to Vicus, slipping his hand into his grandfather's. Vicus gave it a squeeze but didn't say anything. Sorry about your grandma, Hazard, Gregor said. You okay? Yeah. In truth, I do not know how to feel. Solivet rarely spoke to me. I don't think she cared for me. Perhaps it was because she and my father hated each other so much, said Hazard with his usual frankness. The words were so simple and without malice, but their effect on Vicus was immediate and devastating. Solivet and Hamnet, all the awful family history between his wife and his son, the tragedy at the Garden of Hesperides, Hamnet's mad flight from Regalia, the anger that passed between them in the jungle, losing Hamnet not once but twice. Vicus has a stroke from that. I mean, like, this book, I mean, it's just so, because it's a book for like teens and like young adults, it does that thing where it really, actually I think it's even younger, but it does that thing where it really really drives home its themes at every given point, which when the theme is like human cruelty hurts everyone and violence begets violence and will make things worse for yourself in the long run. I mean, it's brutal. Like, I mean, poor Vicus. Like, I mean, kind of. I don't know. He's kind of confusing. He's married to, like, a horrible person, but, like, I'm sure that's not what he wanted his life to be. I mean, like, come on, dude. Your grandson's sitting there saying that, like, his grandma probably hated him because she and her son hated each other. Like, that's horrible. Now, Gregor is getting ready to find the Bane and to kill him, and he's preparing himself to die as well. So Gregor sends Luxa a note saying he loves her. Then he meets up with Lapblood, who is joined by hundreds of rats who want to join Ripred in this rat resistance. So they then go and meet up with Ripred. And before Gregor leaves to fight the Bane, Ripred tells him that he doesn't believe in Sandwich's prophecies, and he thinks that it's people basically retrofitting events to make sense. And he tells Gregor that he should not fight like he's going to die because it doesn't mean anything. Prophecies, he doesn't believe them, and he shouldn't fight like that. He should fight like he's going to live and like he's going to come home. And this is a great sentiment. I mean, I think it's very important that Gregor fights like he's going to live. I also they kind of try to do this thing of like, well, maybe the prophecies are all a lie. I'm sorry. They are so specific. They are so specific at times. Like, I think some of them are real. So then Gregor heads to the battlefield and gets ready to die. Well, no. He's like, maybe I got a fighting chance now. He obviously wants to hear that. You know, if you're told you have to die, of course you want somebody to give you an out and tell you that there's a way you don't have to. So after heading to the battlefield, he saves his sisters from some rats, and he sees the Bane, and he lets the Bane pursue him, knowing that Ripred is going to protect his sisters because he's there too. So when they meet up, Twirltongue is there too, because again, she's kind of like the mastermind. She's kind of puppeting all of this. So she's there too. Twirltongue says, I'm the king, said the Bane. Yeah, is that how it looks to you? Because from up here, it looks like she's getting you killed so that she can take over. What? The Bane was so far gone that was all it took. Again, he's still a little, like, unhinged from the tail thing. He turned to Twirltongue, his eyes narrowing into slits. You will not take over. I'm the king. I'm the king. Of course you're the king. Who would follow a nothing like me? He's lying. If he's lying, then why are you untouched and I'm like this? Because kings are bold and brave fighters. Your scars are badges of your might. No one would follow someone as untried and as feeble as myself. No, you're right. No one will follow you. No one will ever follow you again. The Bane sprang and in one bite ripped Twirltongue's head from her body. It hung in his mouth, teeth bared in a final grotesque grimace, before the Bane flung it at Gregor and Ares, almost hitting them. It smashed into the ground with an awful hollow sound. The Bane stroked his paws over his eyes a few times and then looked up in confusion. Where's Twirltongue? He said forlornly. Where did she go? Neither Gregor nor Ares replied. Twirltongue? She's dead. You killed her. And then he lunged at Ares and Gregor. So, I mean, like, dude is, like, not well. But anyways, it's kind of funny because it's kind of like that SpongeBob scene, but, like, way, way worse. And that is when the actual fight begins. I've got to get in closer if I'm going to take him out, said Gregor. Hang on, said Ares, and suddenly they were spinning over and over, and Gregor found himself directly under the Bane's foreleg. He plunged his sword into the soft flesh. The Bane gave a strangled cry and jerked backwards, freeing Gregor's blade. Get out, Gregor cried. Get out, Ares. He had a terrible sense of dread. Something was wrong about their position, their proximity to the Bane. Even before his bat opened his wings, Gregor knew there was no way they could clear the claws. He thrust his sword into the Bane's direction, but it was too late. Ares, Gregor cried. No. Everything seemed to move in slow motion as the rat caught Ares' wing, spun him around so they were face to face, and pulled him forward. Gregor dropped Solivet's dagger and wrapped both hands around the hilt of his sword. As the Bane sank his teeth into Ares' neck, Gregor's blade pierced the rat's heart. For a moment they hung there, interconnected, supported by teeth and sword and claws. Then the Bane made an unearthly sound and rammed his free paw into Gregor's chest. Gregor lost his grip on the sword as he flew back into the air and slammed onto the stone floor. His hand went to his breastbone. The claws had torn aside his armor and opened a hot, wet hole in his chest. His fingers pulsed with the rapid beating of his heart. Above him, Ares still dangled from the Bane's jaw. The rat opened his mouth, and the bat fell, lifeless, to the ground. The Bane pawed at the blade in his chest, trying to dislodge it. Then he became still and slowly sank down on 4 legs, onto his side, as if to curl up, and rolled onto his back. He knew they were dead, both Ares and the Bane, because only one creature was breathing, and it was Gregor. Despite this knowledge, despite the pain, he dragged himself across the floor to his bond. Gregor pressed his face into the bat's blood-soaked chest, hoping in vain for a heartbeat, for a chance to revive him. But he had gone. No one could survive a wound like that. Gregor's right hand reached out and found Ares' claw and latched onto it. Ares, the flyer, I bond to you. The words went through his mind, but he couldn't speak them, not anymore. So after this, Gregor passes out, and he thinks he's gonna die. He lives, though, and he wakes up in a hospital in Regalia, and he learns that he was rescued by Photos Glogo and Zap, and they had to gnaw off Ares' claw because Gregor would not let go of it. So most of the characters that we know survived, but Rip Red died. So after the Bane's death, the rat army collapsed, and there was to be an official surrender in the arena soon. But who's going to represent the rats? It's Rip Red. He didn't die. They don't really keep up that little lie for that long. He does now, though, have a second scar. So now it's like he has an X on his face. But look, it forms an X, the mark borne by the peacemaker, said Nerissa. Many of us have scars that cross. Think of the words, said Nerissa, and the arena quieted to hear her recite the poem from the prophecy room. Gregor could hear everyone murmuring to one another that this was true, that the prophecies were written in stone, but the rat was looking at Gregor, smirking and rolling his eyes ever so slightly, as if to say, see what I mean? Well, he had no way to prove it. Gregor was suddenly convinced that Rip Red had given himself the second wound. It would be a small price to pay for being designated the peacemaker. And then Luke's, well, I gotta read a bit more. Good, then you should have no problem peacefully leading your fellow gnawers into the uncharted land, said Luxa. This surprised even Gregor, although in retrospect, maybe it shouldn't have. When she had started the war, Luxa had told Gregor, we may as well get it over with, have the war that will answer the question of who stays and who goes. But he had thought that with all that had happened during the war, that she might have changed her mind. Yes, I do have a problem with that, Your Highness, so much so that I flatly refuse to do it. What do you say to that? I say that you may go peacefully or by force. It is your choice. If it is another war you're looking for, then believe me, you shall have it. But I wonder how you will fare with your limping army and your broken city and me at your throat instead of your back. I do not need you, Rip Red. I have Gregor. Do you? I wouldn't count on it. Even if he stays, I'll wager he finds your measures too harsh. Perhaps he will even remember past kindnesses and take my side instead, retorted Rip Red. Gregor's mouth opened in disbelief. What were they both doing? You're really going to do it, aren't you? You're really going to go back to war, Gregor said. He could feel something boiling up inside of him. So we'll just forget about what happened, the jungle, the firelands, the Bane. His voice was rising, and he could feel the rager side taking over. Forget about everybody who's dead. Tick and Twitch-Tip and Hamnet and Talia and Ares and your parents, Luxa, and your pups, Rip Red. Let's just forget about everybody who gave their lives so that you could have this moment where you could make things right again, so you could stop the killing. We're fighting for the same thing, remember? You two owe each other your lives, you owe me your lives, and now you stand there and ask me to choose between you, to help you kill each other. Gregor yanked Sandwich's sword from his belt and swung it so violently that even Luxa and Rip Red stepped back. Well, guess what? The warrior's not fighting for either of you. And with that, Gregor took the sword blade between his hands and slammed it across his leg with such force that it snapped in two. There, the warrior's dead. I killed him. And so the prophecy of time is fulfilled, said Nerissa breathlessly. The prophecy thing is funny, but I mean, Gregor is right. And I'm glad he has that moment. I'm glad he gets to say his piece. So after this, they talk about what to do because they're like, well, treaties never last. So Luxa and Rip Red bond. So they recite the bond that humans and flyers do. And that's really powerful, but they still have to kind of like negotiate what happens next following the war. And so Lizzie, at her suggestion, they decide to form a council of delegates from all the species to negotiate the impacts of the war. And each delegate is chosen by other species. So in the end, they have Marith for the humans, Nike for the bat, Temp for the crawlers, Heronian for the mice, Lapblood for the rats, Reflex for the spiders, and a mole for the mole. They don't even give him a name. Or I think they say like you can't pronounce it or something. I think it's funny though. But so after this, Gregor heads home and Luxa she comes up to hit with him briefly just to get a look at the stars over Central Park, which is funny because you can't really see that many stars in New York City at night. But then she goes back down to the Underland and they never see each other again. I mean, Gregor obviously has a lot to process after he comes back, and he has this bit at the end, literally like the last pages. Gregor turned on the television and flipped through the channels. He stopped on the news. A bomb had blown up in a marketplace somewhere, killing 49. There were body parts and smoke and relatives wailing. The next story was about refugees dying on the road. Driven from their homes by an enemy army, the news anchor was just starting to show a grainy video of a soldier who had been taken hostage when his mother reached in and switched off the television. She looked so sad. I think you've seen enough, Gregor. It had all looked pretty familiar. The bodies, the fear, the desperation. These things had always been here in the Overland, he supposed, but he had never paid any attention to them until now. Seeing the news had made him think. He was safe for the moment here in the playground, but people all over the world were suffering, starving, fleeing, killing one another as they waged their wars. How much energy they put into harming one another, how little into saving. Would it ever change? What would it take to make it change? He thought of Lux's hand pressed into Rip Red's paw. That's what it would take. People rejecting more, not one or two, but all of them, saying it was an unacceptable way to solve their differences. By the look of things, the human race had a lot of evolving to do before that happened. Maybe it was impossible, but maybe it wasn't. Like Vicus said, nothing would happen unless you hoped it could. If you had hope, maybe you could find the way to make things change, because if you thought about it, there were so many reasons to try. This book totally did not hit me as hard when I was younger, because I was kind of like what Gregor said. Obviously, when you're a kid, if you have the luxury to, you don't really pay much attention to the news and to these things that are happening, and even when you see them happening, you don't really understand. Reading this from the viewpoint of an adult, it's really different, and it's really depressing, and I think it really just like, I think Suzanne Collins is such an insanely talented and insanely important author for the generation that she was writing in, because if you've read Hunger Games, it has a very similar anti-war message, and you can so see how these two series like relate to each other thematically. And I think that she does such a good job of introducing these themes in a way that is palatable and not crazy overwhelming when you're a kid. Because at the start, it's really like a fantasy book. It's about adventure, prophecies, strange lands, new species, things like that. It has a lot of that. It has a lot of excitement. It has a lot of funny moments, a lot of like other things I didn't really talk about because it's not the point of this video. But it's brutal. It's a very, very clear and straightforward, that's like the last page of the book that I just read you. Like, that is the most clear message of the whole thing, that war is not the way to solve things, that it is useless, that all it does is create more violence and more hurt, and like that what it's going to take is people refusing to solve their problems that way. That's what Gregor does. Gregor takes a different route than the one that Hamnet took. Hamnet just left totally. Gregor stays and tries to do the best that he can. And it is because of him that they didn't go back to war again at the end. So, he does play a really important role because he refuses to be part of it anymore. And he says as much. There's also so many other instances. Hazard plays an important role just by the simple act of, wanting to speak the languages of other species. You have that moment with the scorpions where they talk it out because they can talk it out, because they do speak each other's language, and because they took that step to try to solve things diplomatically. Like I said, when I read this as a kid, I did not understand these themes, even though they are so, through every single point, so consistent thematically in these books. I just think that they're so good. Thinking back to the start of this video where I went through Suzanne Collins' history, why she writes her books, and what her goal is, I think she absolutely nailed it. And I think that that's why I really wanted to talk about it, because I think it's so sad to me that people have not read these books, especially because The Hunger Games is so massively popular. And The Hunger Games does a lot of these things well, also, but these are a different book series. They're for a different audience. One thing that I've always been interested in about is why these books were not as popular as as The Hunger Games. And I think it does come down to the audience that they're made for. When she wrote this, the Scholastic book company, they rate this book as being for ages 9 to 12 or grades 4 to 7. So around Gregor's age, as usually happens. Usually the target audience is the age of the protagonists. And I mean, I kept saying like teens and young adults because the themes are very mature, but the writing style and the way that those themes are presented are not mature. It is very obvious when you're reading it that it is for that reading level. I think that part of why this wasn't as popular is because a message like this, I think it's important for kids that young to read it and to see a message like this, to start to think critically about politics in a way that feels palatable and that is a lot more easily approachable and that is digested through the lens of your protagonist. I think that's important. But I do think that that message is not really understood. I mean, I didn't understand it when I was a kid. That is not what I took away. What I took away from this book, and what so many of you guys did when I comment about it, if you had read it, was just like big bats, cool roaches. Like, I mean, it makes sense. It's a fantasy book. That's what you take away from it when you're kids. When you talk about the Hunger Games, that is not what you take away from it. What people remember is the brutality, is the war, obviously the movies, but like people remember that. And I think that's because that book series is for like high schoolers. The first one is rated from ages 12 to 18 or grades 7 to 12. That is, I mean, like like you're talking about elementary school versus elementary/middle school versus end of middle school to end of high school. Totally different audience that you're writing for, and I think that that really shows. And I definitely think that that's like why this book series, it was not as popular. I'm really glad that she went on to write The Hunger Games. Obviously, like, it has very similar messaging, a little bit different, and goes about it in a different way, a pretty different plot. It's a lot more impactful to the readers because, one, readers are at an age where they're able to understand it, and two, you're able to write differently. I mean, I still think that this book is really impactful, but also like I am a very emotional like media consumer, so it doesn't take a whole lot to be impactful to me. I don't think that that means that these books aren't impactful to anybody else, but like I think that that's important to mention. I mean, you can see me like tearing up when I'm just like talking about it. Like, I'm a very emotional reader, TV consumer, anything. So like, I don't know. I think that that's part of why it's not as well read, but like I really recommend reading these. I really enjoy reading like children's books and young adult books because I mean they're a lot easier to read. When I read, I don't really want to think too hard. Like, I started reading more when I was in grad school, and I started picking up these old books that I used to read because I wanted to read kids' books, because when you're in grad school you read a ton and it is very taxing, and if you're reading for fun it needs to be like the most dumbed down, easy to read thing ever. And that's why I rediscovered like, oh my god, like the things that I think children's books authors are just geniuses. Like, a good whatever. I'm not gonna go too much into that tangent, but yeah, I think that these books are so insanely good. That's all I have for this video. I know it's a long one. I really enjoyed making this video. I hope that it reaches a good audience because, like I said, I mean, when I made this channel and I had this theme of like things no one cares about, this is one of the first ideas that I had, and it took me a while to make it, but like I knew I wanted to talk about this because I'm so upset that this does not have as big of a fandom as I think that it should have, but there's so much there, and there's just so much to talk about, and like, it's so good. So thank you to the people who still talk about this book, and thank you specifically to Catherine Sobol. And just, like, I have so much respect and I owe so much to the people who keep fandoms alive, because then when as a person who's just coming back to revisit a fandom, it is so nice to feel like there are people that you can come back to and like people who are still there talking about it. But thank you for watching. Please leave a comment down below if you've read these books, if you didn't finish them and now you're like, oh my god, did not know about all that. But yeah, just let me know what your guys' comments down below are, and yeah, thank you guys for watching. See you next time.